Chapter 151. War is coming. Bruno had more or less suspected that France would begin its propaganda efforts. War was more than looking like a certainty for the world as a whole as the years passed. And Germany had begun preparing long before anyone else. While other nations were still focused on meeting recruitment quotas, Germany was in the process of developing advanced weapons, the latest of which were expected to see full-scale production by 1912, 2 years before the war would break out if all went according to plan. Then again, Bruno had caused so many significant changes in this timeline that it was actually impossible to know when the war would break out and what would be the cause. He often had thought to himself of a dreadful fate of irony, that his assassination by the Black Hand would spark the war without him, rather than the untimely death of Franz Ferdinand. But believe it or not, Erich was very good at his job, and monitoring the ins and outs of the German Reich and those dangerous people residing within its borders, whether temporarily or permanently, was his bread and butter. The Black Hand had, on more than one occasion, attempted to infiltrate the German Reich in a bid to try a second or third time to end Bruno's life. But each time they had found themselves buried in a shallow, unmarked grave in the middle of nowhere. That is, of course, after being dragged to a Stasi black site for interrogation, which, of course, did not officially exist in any record. To put it simply, Bruno was rather satisfied with his investment in his friendship with Erich. Even though the man had long since been driven to a state of never-ending bloodlust and absolute callousness towards life as a result of repeated exposure to the horrors of war, he was a useful bloodhound to send against his enemies. And it was perhaps because of that the two men were meeting in a public setting within the city of Berlin at the moment. Erich and Bruno were both dressed in an expensive choice of attire, which Erich couldn't help but comment on, knowing his friend's true nature. "It must be killing you to wear that suit. You look the part of a proper nobleman, and I know how much you like to pretend to be humble." Bruno, like Erich, was smoking a cigarette while drinking from a cup of premium coffee with his free hand. He placed down the cup and looked Erich in the eyes, not even bothering to make a statement of defense towards his humbler attitude towards life. Instead, he smirked while accepting his friend's banter, as one would normally be inclined to do so. "You must be loving this. Seeing me waste a ludicrous amount of money building lavish palaces, while surrounding myself in expensive clothing, shoes, and other accessories like this fucking tie that I want to rip off of my throat with every agonizing minute I am forced to wear such an absurdity." Erich broke out into a fit of laughter upon hearing this remark come from Bruno's mouth. He couldn't help but comment on the man's misery enduring the trinkets that lesser men would kill to have, as if it was some hellish torture designed and optimized by the Lord God Almighty for him personally. "I have to say, frankly speaking, the look of a working-class man doesn't suit you, my friend. You're too gentle. The nobility definitely shows on your face, especially with that fencing scar of yours, no matter how much you like to pretend you're a man of the people." Bruno did not take offense to the man's use of the word gentle to describe his appearance, as it was not used in the modern sense he had grown accustomed to in his past life, which was a reference to meekness, kindness, and in some circles weakness. Rather, it was a reference to his status as a man of noble birth, or a gentleman, a term that, before the fall of the monarchies, was used exclusively, much like lady, to refer to those of the aristocratic class. However, when the monarchies fell in 1918, and traditional Western civilization with it, any semblance of the meaning to the words gentleman and lady had been watered down so much that they were often used interchangeably with man and woman. So much so that common harlots and streetwalkers would take offense if you dared to insist they were neither noble nor virtuous enough to be called a lady. Thinking back upon it, Bruno couldn't help but shake his head, thinking about the fate of the world he had come from, and how glad he was to be reborn in a time of virtue, culture, and general decency. 3 things that were sorely missing from the world that would come from the Great War. A fate Bruno once more steeled himself to prevent by any means necessary. Erich, of course, could not fathom why his friend had such a dreadful appearance all of a sudden, nor his actions of simply shaking his head. Bruno, of course, did not explain as he recollected his thoughts and entered the world in front of him once more. Instead, he got the point, the reason why he had requested Erich to meet with him on this day. "Do you have what I want?" Seeing how they were no longer exchanging pleasantries, and were instead getting down to business. Eric pulled a folder out of his coat pocket and slid it over across the table to Bruno, who opened it and gazed upon the dossier within, as well as the pictures inside of it that were so gruesome they should never be revealed in civilized company. Yet Bruno gazed upon them nonetheless, and in a public setting, as Eric summarized their contents. The Black Hand, as you call it, otherwise known as unification or death, has attempted on 3 separate occasions to infiltrate the German Reich and end your life since that nasty business in Russia. The good news is we intercepted them before they could get anywhere near Berlin. And after some persuading, we managed to gain a significant amount of information about their partners in crime. These fuckers aren't just in Serbia, they're all over the Balkans. And that includes the nations like Bulgaria, who just gained their independence from the Ottoman Empire following the end of the Young Turk movement last month. We can prevent them from causing harm in the Reich, Bruno, but they're just getting started. Their failed attempts on your life have only galvanized their recruitment. I'm afraid these fucking bastards might be the cause of something significantly greater than we can even imagine, especially now that Austro-Hungary is planning to march its troops into Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bruno looked over at Eric, who appeared to be reaching the ultimate conclusion that Bruno had long since known would occur, having learned about in his past life. There was a slight smirk on Bruno's face as he caused Eric to enter a state of mental turmoil. Like what? The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, an act which has the potential to cause all of Europe to break out into a major global war. Eric stared at Bruno with a daunted expression on his face. Bruno just announced a fear he had not even thought about, as if it was a natural occurrence. And it was only then that Eric began to understand just how far Bruno had been outmaneuvering his opponents. But the idea was surreal. Had Bruno been preparing for a global conflict since their days at the academy when they were mere cadets? That was over a decade prior. Was this his whole reason for joining the army? The mere thought was enough to drive Eric into madness. He was just about to ask something when Bruno closed the folder and handed it back to him. After which Bruno raised a single question with a curt tone in his voice. Have you alerted Austro-Hungarian intelligence to what you have found? Eric silently shook his head, still trying to fathom the depths of Bruno's cunning and planning. But when Bruno smiled next, finishing his coffee with a sneer on his face, before standing up from his seat, Eric felt chills down his spine, especially as Bruno practically confirmed that things were going according to his plans. Good. Make sure to keep it that way. We wouldn't want the Austrians to spoil our fun now, would we? Bruno was about to turn away when Eric abruptly stood up, catching the notice of several people from nearby. He quickly realized he couldn't speak his thoughts aloud in German, or else the people who were now watching the two of them would hear his words. And thus, he whispered to Bruno in Russian his exact and terrifying thoughts. Don't tell me. You have known all about this. For Bruno silenced Eric's interrogation as he leaned over and patted the man on the shoulder. His words sounded like the devil whispering sweet poison into his ears as he did so. A war is coming, my friend. It can't be avoided. Postponed perhaps, but either way there is nothing we can do to stop it. Isn't that what you have always wanted? Bruno then walked off without saying another word, leaving Eric absolutely speechless. One thing was certain. Eric had grown 10 times more afraid of Bruno than he had in the past, and was beginning to consider transferring back to the army. As if Bruno's words were true, this war would be on a scale never before seen in human history, or at least not on the European continent. And like hell, he was going to miss out on all the fun. Chapter 152, Restoring a Broken Friendship. Bruno met with Heinrich not long after he had done so with the other of his 2 best friends. Frankly speaking, war has a way of making men discover who they really are, and it turned out that Eric and Heinrich were the exact opposite when the bullets started flying. Heinrich's sole purpose in warfare was to mitigate the suffering that his own men endured, and that the civilians caught up in the conflict were forced to undergo as a tribulation placed upon them by God Almighty. Eric, on the other hand, was a sadistic, cold-blooded killer who took enjoyment in the torture, murder, and pain that others faced against his hands and that of his men. Such men were unsuited to the peaceful state of civilized society. But in times of war, they were among the greatest weapons to be wielded by a commander, if one utilized them properly, that is. The problem was that these types of men were also a double-edged sword. and because of that they needed to be kept very close to their master, lest they act out on their own volition and cause unnecessary complications. Bruno had learned this the hard way, and he would not suffer from such a mistake a second time. And though Eric didn't realize it, Bruno's vigil eye was constantly cast upon him and his activities as the current director of the Stasi. Heinrich, on the other hand, continued to pursue his military career. Though colonial conflicts were more or less being fought, the man instead stayed within the fatherland, proving to be exceptional during both times of war and peace as an officer in the Kaiser's army. And because of this, he would likely be a full-fledged colonel by the time the war broke out. Even so, Bruno also kept the man close to him. He was, after all, the sentimental type, caring deeply about human beings, even those from the enemy nation. Such men were also a liability on the battlefield, but for reasons opposite as Eric. Even so, the two men were useful. Heinrich reminded Bruno that unnecessary cruelty, which he was prone to as a man who was by nature callous and uncaring toward strangers, nearly always caused more problems than it solved. But Eric acted as the devil on Bruno's shoulder, reminding him that sometimes brutality and ruthlessness towards one's enemies was also necessary. As mercy, though useful in certain situations, if given too often, would result in your enemies taking advantage of your kindness. Something that could easily result in catastrophic consequences for not only Bruno but the men beneath his command. And the last thing Bruno wanted was to return to his family in a coffin. Bruno, having met with Eric and spoke with the vicious bastard about his plans for the future, had decided to do the same to the little angel on his shoulder. Heinrich and Alia frequently visited Bruno's home, even now that Bruno was living in much more luxurious conditions. But today was perhaps the first time in half a year that Bruno decided to drop by his trusted friend's home. And when he did so, he was indeed surprised. The relatively comfortable home that Heinrich had lived in had been fully transformed by his adopted daughter. From a pigsty which was only habitable by a young bachelor, to a rather clean and comfortable abode meant for a loving family. Granted, Heinrich's home situation was a bit unorthodox, what with him being a single father of an adopted war orphan. But even so, Alia seemed much more happy with her current life than she had upon first entering the German Reich. She was busy in the kitchen cooking up a meal for herself, her adopted father, and her adopted father's close friend, someone who Alia was still timid around. After all, while living in Russia during the Civil War, she had heard all too frequently about the legendary Red Scourge and the amount of deaths he was responsible for. To her, he was almost like a mythical monster taken human form. Even if Bruno was her adopted father's best friend, he was still a terrifying existence to a young girl who lived in Germany solely because of the war that Bruno had, to some degree, been the cause of. Even so, she brought Bruno and Heinrich food and drinks while returning to the kitchen, not wanting to look upon the man whose legendary march through the Volga region had been in part responsible for her family's death. Bruno couldn't help but chuckle at the young woman's timid nature, despite all the time they had spent together at this point. Honestly, Heinrich, the girl is going to have to learn to confront her fear of me, eventually. It has been over a year since you brought her back to Berlin. The amount of meals we have all shared together, for Christ's sake, she has lived under my roof for more than a few weeks while we have been deployed abroad. Heinrich couldn't help but stare at Bruno. Both of them were taking a drink as the former playboy narrowed his eyes at his best friend, making a comment about his appearance and why people might fear him so much. It wouldn't hurt if you smiled once in a while. Your resting expression can be quite dreadful to a young girl who has heard rumors about you being a demon wearing human skin. I mean, I know you better than most. But if you would permit me to be blunt with my language, the way you look at people, it's almost as if you're thinking about eating their liver. Bruno couldn't help but find this remark deeply offensive, not in actuality, but purely in jest as he scoffed and retorted to this insult. Eat their liver? I assure you my thoughts are far more tame than that. You wound me, sir. No, but seriously, if she is this afraid of me, then what would she think of our mutual acquaintance? You know, the so-called terror of Belgorod. The relationship between Heinrich and Eric had soured following their time apart during the Russian Civil War. Heinrich found himself appalled by Eric's actions in Belgorod and the reason for why he gained such an abhorrent nickname. They eventually had a falling out shortly before Eric departed from the military and transferred to the Kaiser's secret police. Bruno seldom mentioned Eric to Heinrich because of this, and vice versa. However, it was important for him to do so now. And as expected, Heinrich's reaction was as vitriolic as Bruno had expected, placing his beer mug on the table before lecturing Bruno for keeping contact with what was clearly a deranged sadist. Don't tell me you still talk to that murderous psychopath? I don't know what the Kaiser was thinking, putting such a monster in charge of his secret police. After what he did in Belgorod, though I have no proof to verify my suspicions, I have no doubt in my mind that the man is framing many of the people suspected of treason just so he can murder them in cold blood. Bruno looked entirely unfazed by Heinrich's outrage. After all, he had on more than one occasion ordered Eric to do just that. In fact, he had never told Heinrich the real reason Eric was selected for his current job, but considering the exact reason for his visit, Bruno finally decided to come clean about it. I recommended him to the Kaiser for his current position. Heinrich's scream was so loud that it caused Alia, who was in the kitchen cleaning dishes, to flinch and drop a plate on the floor. You fucking what? Why would you ever do such a thing? You know what kind of sick bastard he is. Why would you give him a position where he could easily abuse his power to harm innocents? Bruno narrowed his eyes and looked over at Heinrich's seat, where he was now standing above, voicing his outrage. It was a stern gaze, one that silently commanded the man to sit back down and behave himself, which obediently did upon instinct. As for Bruno's next words, they didn't immediately answer Heinrich's question. Rather surprisingly, he called out to Alia to make sure she had not harmed herself by accident because of her father's sudden outburst. Alia, are you okay? Alia quickly called back, ensuring both her father and her guest that she was fine and was currently cleaning up the mess she had made by accident. I'm fine. I'm sorry for the disturbance. Please continue with your conversation. I will have this mess cleaned up momentarily. Seeing how the girl had not accidentally cut herself on the shards of ceramic, and in fact did not need medical treatment, Bruno sighed in relief before calling back to her, showing his concern and a more human side to himself which Alia had only ever witnessed the man act towards his family. All right, I'm just checking. Do be careful when cleaning up the shards of that plate. Though I am qualified to act as field medic, I do believe I have had a bit too much to drink to adequately stick any wounds you might incur, and I would prefer not to have to drive you to the hospital. Alia was slightly flustered by the concern that Bruno showed her and thanked him, while her adopted father stared at Bruno, still enraged by his admission and waiting for a proper explanation, which Bruno gave him immediately after hearing the girl's thanks. Where was I? Oh right. I was about to tell you my exact reasons why I recommended Eric to the Stasi before you so rudely interrupted me with your outburst. Heinrich, do you really think that after what the war did to that man, it would be wise to keep him in the military? At least during a time of peace? What kind of influence would he have on the men if he suddenly became bored? Or perhaps you think it would be prudent to discharge him and send him onto the streets where there are countless innocent victims waiting for him to prey upon. Frankly speaking, I had two options with Eric: put him down like a rabid dog, or unleash him upon the enemies of the Kaiser. Not all of our adversaries lie outside of our borders, Heinrich, and I assure you I have eyes watching that man at all times. As does the Kaiser. If he acts out, he will be dealt with. But for the time being, he has proven to be a reliable weapon to be wielded against the enemies of the crown who reside within our borders. Besides, when the war finally arrives, I will need his services once again. It's best to keep a knife sharp and close by your side, even in times of peace, don't you agree? We wouldn't want our little hellhound growing complacent now, would we? I'm not asking you to make up with the man, but I am asking you to tolerate his existence when he comes back to my side in the near future. Because believe it or not, Heinrich, these days of peace we currently enjoy aren't going to last forever. It will not be long before a great war erupts across Europe, one that has the potential to engulf the entire world in flames. And when that day comes, men like Eric will be very useful. So what do you say? Are you willing to put aside your differences and work together for the sake of God, Kaiser, family, and fatherland? Heinrich sighed heavily after hearing this request from a man he would consider to be his brother. And because of this, he gulped down the rest of his beer before ultimately agreeing to what Bruno asked of him. That piece of shit will most certainly drag the both of us into hell with him if given the chance. But I trust your instincts more than my own. And if what you say is really going to come to pass, then even I must admit that we are destined to face the good Lord's judgment, regardless. So long as you can manage to keep him under control, I won't find fault with you. All right, you. Have my word. When the time comes for the three of us to come together under the banner of the Reich once more, I will tolerate that knave." Bruno immediately reached over and pat his friend on the back, assuring him that everything would work out in their favor. After which, they continued to share their drinks before Bruno headed home for the evening to spend the rest of the night with his beloved family. 153 Mending the Rift One Step at a Time. It was not long after Bruno had met with Heinrich and Erich that he forced the two men to sit together at a local pub. Hearing Heinrich pledge that he would let bygones and be bygones was one thing, but actually seeing it in person was another. And though Bruno trusted Heinrich well enough to be a man of his word, if the two men were still going to talk about one another behind their backs, while not saying a word to each other until the war finally broke out, then what was the point of all this work? Because of this, Bruno arranged for a meet-up between the three of them where he would act as the mediator. By now, they had all consumed over a liter of beer, which, for Bruno, was not enough to even catch a buzz. As for Heinrich and Erich, their alcohol tolerances were as different as their personalities, with Erich being a man capable of contending with Bruno for the heavyweight crown of the world's greatest drunkard, while Heinrich would pass out and throw up after consuming a little over a liter of beer. Because of this, only one of the three men was dreadfully drunk, slurring his words as he decried his old friend, turned bitter enemy sitting across from him with a smug look on his face. "Why you're a psychopath, you know that. What you did?" The man trailed off into total silence, blinking his eyes as if he was trying to figure out whether he was awake or not. All the while Erich shook his head in silence. A look of disdain was clearly on his face. Bruno felt quite embarrassed by his friend and his inability to hold his liquor. He was one sip away from rolling back in his chair and splitting his head against the edge of another table. Because of this, Bruno was face-palming and sighing heavily, using his index finger and thumb to rub the bridge of his nose as if he was trying to soothe a headache, or worse, a migraine. After several moments of awkward silence, Heinrich was about to say something again when Bruno swiped the man's beer from him and downed what remained of it, something that took a whole 15 seconds for Heinrich to fully process and formulate a response to. You bastard, that's mine." Bruno, however, pulled out his wallet and tossed a few marks on the table. There was no way they were going to get anything done tonight, now that Heinrich was completely wasted less than an hour into their discussion. After paying the bill, Bruno patted Erich on the back and told him to go home and rest, and that he would be in touch with him soon for a special assignment. All the while, Bruno picked Heinrich out of his seat and helped him walk home, primarily by acting as a means for the man to grab onto and not fall over. As the two men walked through the streets of Berlin in the middle of the night, Heinrich couldn't help but make a comment to Bruno, having seemingly forgotten entirely about his drunken spat with Erich only a few moments prior, let alone the bitterness he felt towards the man this past year or two since returning home from the war in Russia. "You're a good friend. You know that, Bruno? I like hanging out with you, and Erich like this. Why don't we do this more often?" Bruno couldn't help but chuckle at this comment, seeing how just a few minutes ago he was telling Erich that he was a psychopath and a terrible person. The get-together had gone about as well as Bruno had planned, but the enmity between both Heinrich and Erich was deep. Neither side was really wrong as far as Bruno was concerned, or in the right, for that matter. Heinrich felt that Erich was a danger to himself and everyone around him, and had done many unforgivable things to sate his own bloodlust. He did not want to associate with such vile people for obvious reasons. Meanwhile, Erich felt as if he had been betrayed by one of his closest friends. They had all done horrible shit in Russia, and though people referred to Heinrich as the Saint of Tsaritsyn, he had spilled more than his fair share of blood during the conflict, much of which belonged to prisoners of war, which itself was a war crime, according to the Hague Conventions, and was no worse than what Erich had done. Heinrich had after all participated in the rounding up of the Red Army's survivors within the Ingria and Volga regions, which under Bruno's orders were executed. He knew they were going to be killed and was complicit, nonetheless. Because of this, Erich believed Heinrich was a massive hypocrite and was simply judging him for acting the same way they had done in the early stages of the war. From Bruno's perspective, both men had as much blood on his hands as he did. And frankly speaking, he did feel Eric had a point that Heinrich was judging him rather unfairly, considering all they had endured together. Besides that, Eric had already been punished for his insubordination, not in any official capacity, but Bruno made sure the man learned never to betray his orders ever again. At the same time, Bruno was not blind to the fact that the war had changed Eric into something akin to a demon. Psychopathy, Machiavellianism, narcissism, and sadism were all archetypical traits of the arch-nemesis of the Lord's angels. And in many ways, Eric displayed these psychological tendencies after surviving the war in Russia. This was no fault of Eric's. War had a way of changing men, especially after they were forced to do horrific things, either in pursuit of victory or merely for their own survival. This change was seldom for the better. And because of this, Bruno did not blame Eric for what he had become. If anything, he blamed himself, and because of this, he had an almost self-loathing tone in his voice as he responded to Heinrich's words. I would also like for us to go out together more often. As much as I love my family, I do miss hanging out with my friends on occasion. But Heinrich, you do know why this is not the case, right? You and Eric don't get along so much these days. Heinrich was barely conscious. It was a miracle he could even speak, let alone walk. Well, frankly speaking, Bruno was the one doing most of the walking for the two of them. Either way, it was because his mind was not exactly functioning as God intended that he was quick to deny this very real fact of life. What? You're joking, right? Why? Wouldn't Eric and I talk? We're best friends. Almost as great as you and I are. We have known each other since. There was a long pause after this, almost as if Heinrich could not even remember how he and Eric had met. And then after several moments of silence, he was quick to ask what the hell he was even talking about in the first place. I'm sorry. What were we talking about? Bruno chuckled, because he knew his friend was in for a world of hurt the next morning. But at the same time, he was happy, not because of the horrific hangover Heinrich would have when he woke up, but because somewhere deep down inside of his mind, the man still thought of Eric as a great friend. And if that was the case, then mending the rift between the two of them was indeed a possibility. Because of this, Bruno was about to say something when he realized they were already at Heinrich's door. He quickly knocked on the door, making sure that the young girl who Heinrich had adopted would open it. And sure enough, she came down the stairs a few moments later. It was so late in the night that it was no wonder that she appeared rather tired as she opened the door, still dressed in her pajamas. When she saw the state her adopted father was in, the young girl quickly woke up and frowned. Bruno was shocked by what he saw, because he had seen the expression on her face a million times in his own home. It was the same expression Heidi took whenever she was scolding either him or their children for doing something wrong. Even more unbelievable was that the teenage girl had damn nearly perfected the tone which Bruno's wife used when she was furious. Papa, what the hell are you doing out so late? I told you to be back by 10 o'clock. Do you have any idea what time it is? And look at you. You're an absolute mess. Did you put him up to this? You know what kind of lightweight the old man is. Bruno felt a bit awkward looking at the teenage girl, who was striking a similar pose that his wife did whenever she was furious with him or their children. It was almost instinctive for him to apologize, and quite frankly, she was owed one. I'm sorry. It had been so long since the three of us went out for drinks that I kind of forgot about his problem. Alia sighed heavily and shook her head before grabbing hold of Heinrich. She proved to be remarkably stronger than Bruno thought she would be as she told him to get lost, while helping Heinrich climb up the stairs of their home so that she could help him get into bed. I'm going to tell your wife all about this tomorrow morning. Speaking of which, I bet she is waiting for your return even now. So hurry up and get lost. I have to help this old drunkard get into his bed. If he doesn't lie face down while he sleeps in such a state, then he is for sure going to choke on his own vomit. And if that happens, I'm holding you responsible. Honestly speaking, Bruno was surprised the girl had the strength of character to yell at him like this, considering that just a few days prior, she was still intimidated by his very presence. It was true what they said. The greatest cure to fear was rage, and this little Russian lass was full of it at the moment. Because of this, Bruno apologized once more before wandering off back to his own estate, where he was almost certain that he would be greeted by his wife, who would no doubt give him a second scolding. 154 The Bosnian crisis resolved. The Bosnian crisis had begun almost immediately after the Ottoman Empire entered a state of revolution. Revolution that lasted less than 30 days, mind you, before the Sultan was forced to concede to the demands of the Young Turk movement and allow for the restoration of the empire's constitution and, to an extent, a new election for parliament. As a result of this, the Balkans were thrown into turmoil, with several nations either directly under the control of other Ottoman Empire as imperial territories or vassal states such as Bulgaria using this as a chance to gain their much-desired independence. And, of course, the Habsburgs used this as a reason to fully annex the region known as Bosnia and Herzegovina, which had for the last few decades been under their indirect control. The moment the Austrian army marched into the Balkans, things got chaotic very quickly. The Serbian king had been forced as a result of the pressure of international influences to agree with the annexation, at least publicly. But behind closed doors, Peter was conspiring with the Black Hand to turn it into a contested affair. The shadowy organization, whose goal was the independence of all Balkan states, and a nation for each ethnic identity in the region, had failed repeatedly to assassinate Bruno after he had revealed he knew of their existence and their crimes. As a result, they had ultimately decided that the cost of losing their members in these failed assassination attempts was simply no longer worth the effort. Bruno had appeared not to have revealed their identity to anyone, despite their multiple attacks on him. Because of this, they instead shifted their focus towards inciting revolt against the Habsburgs' annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Meanwhile, the Ottomans, who had already lost practical control over the region to the Austrians 30 years prior, were more outraged about Bulgaria's declaration of independence, not that they had the military capacity to exact force upon them. However, even so, the Ottoman Empire declared economic sanctions against the Austro-Hungarians for this perceived slight, even though it was quite honestly an inevitability ever since they gained administrative control over Bosnia and Herzegovina decades prior. Luckily for the world, the Black Hand's attempts to incite a violent insurrection by Bosnian nationalists was stomped out before it could begin, because a diplomatic conference was called between the leaders of the great powers, firstly to discuss this annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Secondly, to address the matter of Bulgarian independence. Both of these issues were blatant violations of the previously established Treaty of Berlin and required international attention, lest they break out into a conflict of significant concern not only for Europe, but for the world altogether. Bruno was not privy to these discussions. In fact, he was merely enjoying the peaceful days at home with his loving family and close friends while he could take advantage of them. This was, of course, in between his duties at the Central Division of the German Army's High Command, as well as when he was not manipulating the world's economy or looking for land to purchase that had significant natural resource deposits within them that had yet to be noticed by the greater world. Either way, as always, Bruno was a busy man, so much so that getting involved with a diplomatic conference that was destined to settle itself in a way that favored his overall ambitions in life was simply an unnecessary use of his time. Nor was he exactly qualified to sit at the table with these emperors, kings, and other heads of state. That was, after all, one of the many powers granted to the Kaiser within the German Empire's constitution. Because of this, it was Wilhelm seated at a table with the likes of Franz Joseph I, Nicholas II, Armand Falliers, who was the current president of France at this time, Prime Minister Herbert Henry Asquith of the British Empire, King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, King Peter I of Serbia, among others. Frankly speaking, Bruno had already secured Russia's and Serbia's agreement to the annexation, and they had voiced their support of Austro-Hungary's actions. What was left to dispute were the nations of Great Britain, France, and Italy, all of which had different opinions on the matter. The reality was that this diplomatic conference did not occur in Bruno's past life, as the Germans, through rather cunning diplomatic maneuvering, kept postponing it until it was ultimately dropped altogether. Rather, the disputed topics had been solved via a series of consultation at various capitals, ultimately agreeing to an amending of the Treaty of Berlin. But today, the conference was actually being held, perhaps because of all the changes Bruno had made to the timeline, and hence why all these world leaders were currently gathered in Berlin. While Serbia had shocked the Entente by so easily conceding the issue, Russia was to be expected. After all, Italy had informed Britain and France of the secret alliance that was built between Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Russia. However, Italy still had yet to announce its departure from the Triple Alliance, even though another alliance had been formed without them between the other powers. Because of this, King Victor Emmanuel III tried to swindle Austro-Hungary by demanding the agreed-upon compensation that the Habsburgs had made when Italy first agreed to join the Triple Alliance several decades ago. In order to gain Italian support for their future annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Italy had demanded disputed territories, which they claimed were theirs that Austro-Hungary now possessed, that came both in the Alpine regions of Lower Tyrol and Trento, as well as regions in the Balkans such as the Adriatic littoral and Dalmatia. Thus, when the Italian king so boldly asked for these reasons at the conference in the midst of a heated shouting match, everyone went silent. Italy will agree to recognize Austro-Hungary's annexation of the disputed territories so long as they fulfill the promise they made to us back in '89. Though Italy didn't outright say what this promise was, the members of the imperial powers were all too aware. Because of this, Tsar Nicholas II, Kaiser Franz Joseph I, and Kaiser Wilhelm II all looked at one another with concerned expressions. Basically, Italy was putting them on the spot as to whether or not they wanted the Italians to remain a member of their alliance. But at the same time, they had excluded the Italians from the formation of the League of the Four Emperors for a reason, and hence why the Austrian Kaiser eventually voiced his refusal to give up the land requested by him. I'm afraid I have no idea what His Highness is talking about. This was not exactly something that shocked the Italian king, as he already expected this as the answer he would be given. But frankly speaking, he voiced it nonetheless, either using this as an excuse to officially exit the military alliance he had with the German and Austro-Hungarians, or simply scam them out of disputed territories. Either way, he planned to gain control over Tyrol, Trento, the Adriatic littoral, and Dalmatia, whether by peaceful means or by outright conquest. Since he had his answer now, he would formally withdraw from the Triple Alliance shortly after this meeting. Meanwhile, the negotiations would continue for some time before ultimately enough concessions were made financially in order to ensure the Habsburgs were universally recognized by the great powers of Europe as the rightful rulers of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Addressing current schedule. 155 Noblesse oblige. It did not take long for Bruno to see in the daily newspapers that the Bosnian crisis had more or less been resolved the way it had in his past life, though with some minor changes in circumstance. Russia was not aggrieved by the process and had voted in favor of their ally Austro-Hungary from the start. Serbia, though in agreement, had done so begrudgingly as a result of being forced to concede due to the Black Hand's attempts to kill Bruno on Russian soil. They were still deeply bitter from the result, and it would no doubt be an event that would help spark the Great War in the near future. Italy was also angered by the result, but rather than silently suffer until withdrawing from the Triple Alliance in 1915, a whole year after the Great War had begun in Bruno's past life, they immediately used this conference as a means to leave an alliance that was in practicality already void. This was not exactly a surprise to those who were already aware of what was going on behind the scenes on the global stage, let alone Bruno, who was currently enjoying a nice breakfast with his family. By now Heidi was visibly pregnant, and yet that did not stop the woman from being the taskmaster of their new estate, one which was truly befitting of a prince. All the servants were not only thoroughly vetted, but properly trained, and held to a standard so high that the initial attrition rate was about 90%. If there was a such thing as an equivalent of special forces for maids, butlers, chefs, bartenders, housekeepers, tutors, etc., then Heidi ensured that the home staff that looked after herself, her husband, and her children were all Tier 1 operators. Loyalty to their household was an absolute requirement. The slightest wavering in this regard resulted in an immediate termination of employment. At the same time, the pay was exceptional. Bruno was extremely wealthy and was on track to perhaps becoming the wealthiest man in history. Give or take a decade or two. He had even begun to invest in opening his own national bank in order to compete with groups like the Rothschilds, who, frankly speaking, trusted less than just about anyone in this world. Hiring the best staff, with a salary that nobody else could compete with, was not a problem in the slightest for Bruno's finances. Frankly speaking, Bruno always offered a salary to his employees that was at least 25% higher than his competitors. In addition to this, he gave out exceptional bonuses. The higher one's performance at work, the more they would be paid, no matter their position. This was a great way to secure the best talent and giving them a sense of loyalty to their employer, while also making sure that his employees were well taken care of. Perhaps it was because of what he had witnessed corporate greed do to the world in his past life. But as an owner of several businesses and significant assets, Bruno had a sense of noblesse oblige. It was his duty as a man in a position of privilege, wealth, and power to use those three things for the benefit of those beneath him, especially those who were his direct subordinates. Whether it was the soldiers beneath his command, or it was the men and women in his employment, Bruno had always treated them as if they were his own family members. Not only because it was expedient, but also because it was the right thing to do. It was perhaps because of this that he knew the name of every single member of his estate staff and was quick to thank one of the maids who came over to fill his cup of coffee after she witnessed it was getting close to being empty. "Thank you, Frida." Bruno was not what one would call a morning person and often required at least 3 cups of coffee before he could be fully functional for the day. It was perhaps because of this that the young maid always kept a close eye on his cup, ensuring that he had the amount of coffee he needed, when he needed it, not a moment earlier, nor a moment too late. It was indeed a rare talent, one that Bruno greatly appreciated, even if he was too groggy to properly express his thanks. Perhaps it was because the man sounded so tired as he yawned before taking another sip from his cup, that the maid simply responded in a way that dismissed his appreciation altogether. "It is nothing that requires such gratitude, Your Highness. I was simply doing as I am paid to do." Bruno, however, frowned when he heard this. Not because he was particularly insulted, but because he felt the woman's own humble attitude was a bit too self-loathing. Though her abilities to perform as a maid were exceptional, and she was paid her worth, the woman was always too hard on herself. Perfectionists were often this way when they felt they did not live up to the standards which they had imposed upon themselves. Because of this, Bruno was quick to correct the woman. Even if he was exhausted, he felt she needed to be easier on herself, especially if she was going to last a long time at this job, which is exactly what he desired. "Not everything needs to be perfect, young lady. You have a bad habit of looking down on your own exemplary skills. Frankly speaking, your skills are second only to perhaps the head maid in this house. And if you think to the contrary, perhaps I should lower your pay according to an amount appropriate for your own assessment of your self-worth. Besides, I have told you 1,000 times by now, please don't refer to me by my honorifics. I freaking hate that. If you can't call me by my name, then call me sir, or simply Mr. von Zehntner, okay?" Frida's eyes bulged open when she heard this. Not because she actually believed Bruno would dock her pay, but because the man was subtly saying that if he didn't believe in her performance, he wouldn't be paying her the amount he did. And because of this, she quickly bowed her head and thanked the man. All the while Heidi entered the room, having overseen the cooking staff's preparation of today's breakfast like the proper tyrant she was. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate your kindness." The woman looked up at Bruno's satisfied smile, only with her eyes, before quickly looking back at the floor, blushing as she did so. That is until Heidi yelled at her to go off and help one of her fellow maids with the laundry for the day. "That will be all, Frida. Breakfast has been prepared, and my husband has had enough coffee this morning. You can go help Bertha with the laundry if you have nothing else to do." Heidi's words weren't exactly meant to be stern towards the young maid. Even if the girl was slightly crushing on Bruno, they were actually meant for Bruno, who without her interference would drink nothing but coffee and beer, something which was deeply unhealthy for the man. And because of this, Bruno sighed and shook his head as he sipped on the current glass he was drinking. All the while Frida fled the scene. Heidi, however, took her seat across from her husband and looked at him with a loving smile, commenting on how happy she was with the way he treated their staff, even if it was with her usual snark. "My oh my, if word gets out that the Red Scourge is so kind to his employees, your enemies may not fear you anymore. What will the great General Oberst do then?" Bruno could help but smile at his wife's words, which he knew were filled with love and warmth, despite what she had said. He decided to play along, with his own denial of the accusations of him being a monster. "Contrary to common belief, I'm not a demon or a wild animal wearing the flesh of a man. I'm only unkind to those who provoke me, or those who deserve it. If the communists had their way, girls like her would be selling their bodies on the street for a loaf of bread. That is, of course, assuming she had not already starved to death. Even if she did manage to land a proper job as a maid, she would not be paid her worth. And to me, that is a far more monstrous crime than anything I have ever done. Heidi continued to smile at Bruno while her face rested in her hands. All the while, her children ignored their parents' subtle flirting via unorthodox methods. Instead, they ate their meals with gusto. Heidi couldn't help but dig into her own plate, while complimenting the man on not being a monster like some of the people he hung out with. Yes, we all know how much you hate the Marxists. Now finish your meal, love. It will give you the necessary strength to get through the work you have to do today. Bruno ultimately would not argue with his wife and would indeed finish his meal before getting ready for the day's work, after which he would return home and spend the evening with his family, much how he always did during such peaceful times. And though he wished such days would last forever, Bruno was all too aware of the storm clouds gathering in the distance, which would soon approach the borders of the Reich. And when they did, hell would come with them. 156. A visit to Romania. Romania was a nation whose contributions to the Great War in Bruno's past life were less than significant. In fact, what it was most well known for was losing about 1/10 of its population during the entire conflict. By the time they entered the war in 1916, Romania had a population of roughly 7 million, and by the time the armistice of FOC Ani was signed roughly a year later, over 700,000 soldiers and civilians had died due to causes related to the war. It was an unmitigated disaster for the Romanians who had entered the war on behalf of the Allied powers for the sake of seizing many lands that belonged to the Kingdom of Hungary as part of their ambitions to untie Greater Romania. Of course, the victory the Central Powers gained over the Kingdom of Romania in 1917, much like the one they gained over the Russian Empire that same year, was nullified when the war finally ended in the Allied powers' favor a year after these treaties were signed. Frankly speaking, if the Kingdom of Romania was not currently one of the world's largest producers of oil, and if it didn't lie on the eastern borders of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then Bruno would have no interest in the region. But Bruno had already made substantial investments into Romania oil infrastructure as far back as 1901 when he came home from the war in the Far East and found himself with a large fortune which his family paid him for the patents of his more modern weaponry. He was, of course, not the only one, with wealthy investors from the United States, Great Britain, and the Netherlands competing for these shares. And Bruno had ultimately walked away with the smallest number of these shares when compared to his competitors because his wealth at the time was not as vast as it was today. However, currently the German Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire were investing heavily into their nation's infrastructure, and Bruno's construction corporations that he either owned directly or had substantial portions of ownership in indirectly, were reaping the benefits of these projects. Because of this, Bruno wanted to connect the Romanian oil fields he had invested in to this transportation network that was being established. However, there were several problems with this. For starters, Bruno's influence over the kingdom was purely as a foreign investor into their oil industry. He had no close ties to the Romanian royal family like he did to the three great powers. While the family which ruled as kings in Romania were in fact a distant branch of the House of Hohenzollern, of which the German Kaiser was a member of, Bruno could at most ask Wilhelm for an introduction. Relying on him for anything related to his ambitions was entirely out of the question. In addition to this, Romania and Hungary's disputes were unreconcilable, unlike the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires whose disputes were over potential colonies in the Balkans. The dispute between Hungary and Romania was one of blood and soil. Both claimed historical and ethnic ties to the disputed regions which were currently under the rule of the House of Habsburg, and such disputes were seldom solved diplomatically, let alone when the potential to claim them via conquest was on the horizon. Convincing the Romanian king to join with the Austro-Hungarians against the Allied powers, when their whole purpose to fight such a war was to gain disputed territory from the Austro-Hungarians, was a diplomatic maneuver which Bruno was not even remotely capable of performing. In fact, Bruno doubted anyone could convince the two monarchs to agree to such a thing, as it would rely on heavy concessions. And for what? Access to oil. This was especially absurd when one realized that Russia and Austro-Hungary themselves were already two of three nations in the world which currently had a larger oil production capacity than Romania. Why should Austro-Hungary give up their lands in Romania in exchange for access to oil, when they already outmanufactured Romania in terms of oil production? It did not make logical sense, nor did Bruno even really agree with such a concession which would be required to mend the two nations. Even so, it was always better to have fewer enemies than more, and with it looking like the Allied powers would initially consist of the nations of Great Britain, France, Italy, and Serbia. Adding Romania to the list, even if they were only capable of mustering around 700,000 men, was less than ideal. Could Romania be taken out very early on in the war, and their oil assets being seized by Austro-Hungary as the result of a heavily punitive treaty? Most certainly. In fact, if they did join the war immediately in this timeline, rather than wait 2 years, Bruno estimated it would take less than a year for him to sweep through both Serbia and Romania, assuming he was of course given command over such a theater. But then again, excessively punitive treaties was ultimately what caused the Second World War to begin in Bruno's past life, the result of which was what Bruno considered to be the destruction of Western civilization as a whole. It was with all of this in mind that Bruno petitioned for a week off from his duties at the Central Division of the German Army's High Command for the sake of visiting Romania. In doing so, he also made a personal request of the Kaiser to reach out to his distant relatives and negotiate with them on his behalf to allow for a proper introduction. Unsurprisingly, the Kaiser agreed to this request. He had long since begun to trust Bruno's judgment, especially when it came to making preparations for the eventual Great European War, which with each passing day was starting to become a more and more realistic possibility. And since Bruno was expressing interest in Romania's oil fields, as well as already had substantial investments within them, it made sense to Wilhelm to at least do the bare minimum in setting up a meeting between the Romanian king and Bruno. Hence why Bruno was now sitting on a train headed to Bucharest. If Bruno was being perfectly honest, he had never actually been through the Hungarian portion of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. During his previous visits, he had only ever passed through the Austrian crownlands. But whether it was in this life, or his past one, long after the empire had faded into the annals of history, Bruno had never stepped foot into Hungary. While Austria was a German state that, for political reasons, had never unified with the German Reich, Hungary and the other regions of the empire were distinctively different, both in terms of culture and heritage, which was evident by the very architecture which was on display in the region. For those who were uninitiated when it came to the beauty and diversity of European architecture, they may look at the many beautiful chapels, palaces, and other grand buildings which stood proudly among the Hungarian landscape, and assume they were no different from the Austrian portion of the empire. But they would be wrong. There were some similar styles due to the proximity which Hungary had with Germany. But there were also both subtle and overt differences even from the styles that were similar to those in Austria. There were even a few Ottoman-style buildings spread throughout southwest Hungary and Transylvania, which had been constructed during a brief era of the Turkish occupation. In this regard, Hungary was perhaps one of a handful of nations in Europe where old Islamic architecture still stood, especially when one considered the fact that most of the European nations who had been subjected to such a dark history had torn down the structures built by the invaders after gaining their independence, as was common in any land occupied by a foreign aggressor. Either way, Bruno never found himself bored while he was traveling through Europe. Many of these buildings, beautiful and magnificent as they were, would not survive the 20th century, or at least had not done so in his past life. Some were rebuilt, but there was a bit of sadness in witnessing a restoration, as one never knew whether it was truly faithful to the original or not. But many others were lost to history, only seen in photographs and paintings that had been made in the era which preceded their ruin. And it was perhaps because he could enjoy gazing upon the glory of pre-war Europe, even those nations outside boundaries of the fatherland, that Bruno was in a rather exceptional mood upon finally stepping foot in the city of Bucharest, where he immediately stuck out as a foreigner. Luckily for Bruno, he was well versed in a variety of languages, having spent his childhood mastering them to a level of proficiency that only a native speaker would normally be able to pronounce. as language was a valuable tool, especially in a time of war, which was ultimately what Bruno had been preparing for ever since he first reincarnated into this life. Hence, despite his distinctly foreign appearance, Bruno was able to get along well enough with the locals as he prepared for his stay in Bucharest, where he was eventually led to the royal palace to be greeted by King Karl I and his wife. Chapter 157. Meeting with the King of Romania. Romania was an interesting place to visit. Bruno had never really been to this part of Europe in his past life, or in this one, for that matter. Hell, despite being relatively close to Germany, all things considered, he was actually more acquainted with East Asian nations than he was with Romania. Even so, he knew the language and had a general understanding of their history, and because of this, he was perhaps one of the better foreign visitors in terms of mingling with the locals. Of course, he did not spend long doing so, at least with the commoner class, because upon exiting the railway station, Bruno was greeted by members of the Romanian royal family who intended to escort him to their royal palace. Bruno sat rather silently in the back of the exported German automobile that the Romanian royal family used for their own transportation around Bucharest and for the transportation of guests. Daimler and Benz had, after all, revolutionized luxury transit entirely due to Bruno's interference. Automobiles that would normally not be produced until the 1930s of this life were all the rage in the German Reich, and naturally, if one was wealthy, they would want such an advanced vehicle for themselves. For example, the primary model that the company sold to the world's elite was the Daimler and Benz 770 Grand Mercedes. It was a beautiful and elegant car, meant for an aristocratic market. And naturally, the Romanian King Karol had used his loose family ties to the Kaiser to get his hands on one when the supply for these vehicles did not meet their excessive demand. And though Bruno didn't realize it, the Kaiser used this fact while negotiating for Bruno to receive a proper introduction to the Romanian royal family. After all, Bruno was the largest shareholder in Daimler and Benz and had been the one who orchestrated both their merging and the introduction of this exquisite and advanced automobile to the market. Upon learning this fact, the King of Romania was exceptionally eager to meet with Bruno, even more so when he learned afterwards of Bruno's already substantial investment in the Romanian oil industry. Bruno wasn't just a powerful Generaloberst in the German military, but he was a wealthy industrialist from a family who had significant ties to German politics and had gained the status of a Russian prince. To put it simply, he was a figure that the Romanian king was all too eager to meet with, even if Bruno still had a tendency to underestimate his own status in this world. It was perhaps because of this that Bruno was so surprised when he finally stood in front of the King of Romania, who himself was acting as if Bruno was a figure well above him in status. Eagerly shaking his hand, he introduced himself and his wife to this foreign guest. Prince Zehntner, I must say it is a great honor to finally meet you in person. I have heard a great deal about you. Your feats on the battlefield are quite renowned, even here in my humble kingdom. But I was indeed surprised when I learned that your industrial interests are even grander in scale. Bruno did not frown when he heard the way the king referred to him. They were strangers and men of supreme status. Though his title in Russia was landless, as governing fiefs were largely a thing of the distant past, it was still a premier noble title, and he had used it correctly. Using the honorific von in his family's surname would be incorrect, as that was a German thing that did not carry over into Russian society. Rather, his Russian princely house was simply known as House Zehntner. Interestingly enough, as far back as the 18th century, distant relatives of Bruno had actually migrated to Russia under a call from Catherine the Great, who herself was born a German princess from Pomerania. She enticed many German settlers to various regions of the Russian Empire to settle and work the land as farmers. This was before Bruno's family gained their status as nobles within Prussia, and because of this, there were quite a few families running around of commoner status within the Russian Empire who shared his name, albeit not his noble status. In fact, there were probably more Zehntners in Russia than there were in Germany at this point in time, as it was a rather rare surname within the German Reich. Even while knowing this, Bruno's march through the Volga region, where many of these distant relatives were settled, was no less ruthless in his pursuit of the Red Army. Of course, Bruno was not exactly surprised that the Romanian king, Karol I, had done a deep dive into his background, if not simply for security measures. Because of this, he responded with the appropriate amount of respect due to a foreign monarch. "You honor me, your majesty. I am but a humble prince, while you are a king. To speak to me in such grandiose ways speaks volumes about the respect you have for me and my accomplishments. I can only hope to return to such gracious behavior. Please, allow me to present you with these humble gifts." Frankly speaking, I would have prepared a much grander gift had I been able to transport it across international lines, but I'm afraid it is still traversing by the sea, and thus you will have to wait a bit longer. Bruno then opened his briefcase, which included some exceptional jewelry that he handed over to the king's security to be properly examined. The gifts were meant for both King Carol I and his wife, Queen Elizabeth. The two had only one child, a young daughter who had died at the age of 3. Unfortunately, because of that, they had no children through which Bruno could establish ties to via friendships that would allow him to manipulate Romanian affairs in the future. Instead, the king's nephew Ferdinand would eventually succeed him when he finally died in October 1914, a few months after the Great War began. That was, of course, assuming things went according to Bruno's previous life timeline. Hence, why Bruno was actually eager to meet with Ferdinand and not Carol, as it would be he who would dictate Romania's entry into the war. Even so, establishing ties to the kings of Romania now was better than doing so later, and because of this, Bruno and Carol continued to exchange pleasantries as the man invited his guest further into his home. Chapter 158, Unintentional Intimidation. As was only common courtesy, Bruno was given a full tour of the Romanian king's estate, as well as a lengthy, albeit interesting, explanation of his family's history. The Kingdom of Romania was young, established as a kingdom as far back as 1881. But the family's house was naturally much older, being the Swabian branch of the House of Hohenzollern, which now ruled over the German Reich. Many people in his place might find such a lecture to be a dull affair, but not Bruno. He was quite an avid enjoyer of history. And naturally, such ancient houses possessed knowledge that one might say was more difficult to dig up through conventional means, either in this life or in his past life. Either way, Bruno had more or less proved his interest to the Romanian king, both in terms of his family's history and his attempts to establish proper ties to them. Bruno was, after all, rather charming when he could be compelled to socialize. By the time dinner came around and the rest of the royal family gathered, Bruno had thoroughly convinced the Romanian king to treat him as if he were an old family friend, rather than, in reality, where this was their first time meeting. Even the Romanian king's wife, Elizabeth, had commented during dinner how Bruno was exemplary of what a perfect gentleman should be, to which Bruno simply replied, "My wife would be happy to hear it." A slight jest that caused several members of the Romanian royal family to laugh. If Bruno were being honest, these last few months, ever since he realized he was starting to become antisocial when visiting the German Kaiser and his family, he had started to take extra steps to re-socialize himself with the world, especially the aristocratic class. Thus, even though he had forced himself to wear a smile and do things right, rather than use any of his usual dark humor around these men and women who were not accustomed to the humor often found among combat veterans like himself. Ultimately, a topic that caused the jovial nature of the conversation to come to a bitter and abrupt end was not broached by Bruno himself this time around, but rather by Ferdinand, whom Bruno had been trying to get the attention of all night. The man bluntly approached a subject Bruno was all too familiar with. There is a rumor that a great European war is coming, one that has the potential to engulf all the great powers. I'm curious about what the general from the German Reich thinks about this matter. Surely you have made some preparations in this regard, have you not? Carol eyed his nephew with a disapproving gaze, not only because it sounded like the man was trying to coerce classified information from their guest under the guise of friendship, but also because it was something the aging king had decided was inappropriate to discuss under the current conditions. Even so, before the man could properly rebuke his nephew for his poor manners, Bruno chuckled and answered the question nonetheless. Do you want my honest answer? Or do you wish for me to merely assuage your fears with empty platitudes? Frankly speaking, Ferdinand had not necessarily expected Bruno to answer with such a response. And while the current king of Romania may not be interested in the subject, as the designated heir to the throne, With his father Leopold having abdicated himself from the line of succession in favor of his children, Ferdinand was all too obsessed with the very real possibility, and thus there was an audible gulp among the dreadful silence that prevailed in the room before he asked Bruno for the honest truth. "Your honest opinion on the matter would be most appreciated." Bruno did not immediately respond. Rather, when he heard the Romanian prince, who would one day succeed his uncle, ask for the truth, the joyful mask he wore to entertain these noble men and women suddenly cracked into a million pieces, only to shatter in the next second to reveal the dreadful, chilling expression Bruno was so renowned for. He took a large gulp from his wineglass, ensuring that there was nothing left of his beverage before responding to the question asked of him in the bluntest way possible. "From my perspective, war between the great European powers is neither a matter of possibility nor probability. Rather, it is an absolute certainty. And this conclusion has already been reached by many of the world's leaders. Fortifications across the world are being built in preparation for this future conflict. Armies are being raised. Weapons are being manufactured on a scale never before seen in human history. And alliances have already begun to be established between the world's greatest powers. Though we don't speak of it in the open, as we all wish for this peace, we now take advantage of it to last as long as possible. Soon the world, not just Europe, will be drenched in blood. Tens of millions will die. And in the end, whatever peace can be established among the ruins of the old world will most certainly result in a second and more devastating conflict within the decades that follow it. Few know this truth I am about to speak, but if I am being 100% honest, I calculated the outbreak of this war as a matter of inevitability as far back as my adolescence. It was the primary reason for me initially joining the German army and continues to be a driving force that propels me to achieve the greatest heights imaginable in my choice of profession. Naturally, we are not the only ones preparing for this war. Our future enemies do so as well. And if I could give you all some advice on the matter, I would assure you that it would be best for your house and for Romania as a whole to stay out of the conflict altogether. But that is ultimately a choice you will have to make when the time to take up arms has finally arrived. So, until that day finally comes for us all, how about we not focus on such dreadful topics and instead enjoy the peaceful years we have to look forward to? Utter silence remained throughout the feast, as glaring eyes were cast towards Ferdinand for souring the mood with such a grim topic. Even the man who had brought up this topic for conversation felt almost sick to his stomach upon hearing Bruno's assessment and seeing the indifference in his eyes as he mentioned the potential outbreak of a global war and the destruction such a horrific conflict would cause. He understood now why so many people spoke of Bruno behind his back, as if he were some kind of monster wearing the flesh of a man. For what kind of human being could entertain such a subject and assert it was a matter of certainty for the future of the human race, and yet act as if he could not be compelled to care about it? Perhaps Bruno's brutal honesty had an exaggerated effect on the Romanian royal family, one which he did not originally intend to have. Though they did not treat him any less friendly, there was indeed a sense of intimidation that Bruno could sense among them, one that might end up working in his favor. Because what kind of madman or monumental fool would declare war, knowing that they had the potential to face such a monster in combat? And though as the years passed by, Bruno would continue building his friendship with the Romanian royal family under the goal of preventing their entry into the upcoming Great War, the reality was that Bruno had single-handedly achieved this end here in this discussion, something he would not have had the possibility to do so early on had Ferdinand kept his mouth shut about such a sensitive topic. Chapter 159, Meeting with a Legendary Genius. Bruno returned to the German Reich shortly after his visit to the Kingdom of Romania, but he did not spend long there. He, after all, had other business to attend to across the Atlantic. While Bruno had long since been investing in a variety of businesses across the land, he had also personally sponsored many inventors. One of whom he desperately wanted to fund was a true visionary, a man who, after his death and until the 1990s, went into a state of relative obscurity despite his contributions, which helped build the foundation of the modern world. For years, Bruno had been trying to acquire the Serbian-American's talents, but the man had eluded his attempts to do so, relying on the likes of American elites to fund his projects. By now, that money was starting to dry up, and Bruno saw this as an excellent opportunity to snatch the exceptional talent for his own ambitions. Because of this, Bruno had finally decided to set sail across the Atlantic to Manhattan in an attempt to meet with the man in person and hopefully convince him to immigrate for a second time in his life, this time from the United States of America to the German Reich. It was a tall task, but one Bruno was attempting, nonetheless. As he wholeheartedly believed, giving Nikola Tesla the funds he needed to bring his many designs to life would be an ultimate benefit to mankind in the long run. Frankly speaking, Tesla was relying mostly on money from his patents at the moment, but those patents would be violated and infringed upon by U.S. corporations when the war broke out, and by the end of the war, he would be effectively bankrupt, or at least most certainly so in the years following its completion. Bruno wanted to prevent this tragedy to scientific achievement from occurring by bringing Nikola Tesla back to the German Reich and giving him damn near unlimited funding in his pursuits. Hence, after a mere 5 days on board an ocean liner, Bruno arrived in the United States of America. Because Bruno was of German stock and spoke damn near perfect English, he blended in quite well with the American population, walking through its streets and taking in the sights of the sleeping giant and its current progress as he made his way towards his ultimate goal, meeting with Nikola Tesla in one of his current offices based out of Manhattan. Frankly speaking, when Bruno arrived at his ultimate destination, he was not the least bit surprised to find that Nikola Tesla was not the least bit pleased to see him. Bruno had been trying for years to get a meeting with the man, and for whatever reason, Tesla had kept eluding him. Ultimately, Bruno had to finally petition for a meeting under a false identity to finally speak with Nikola Tesla, and in doing so, he had, of course, perturbed the man he was trying to coerce. Nevertheless, Bruno had a shameless smile as he introduced himself to a legendary scientist and engineer from his past life. "You are a very difficult man to get a meeting with, but I'm afraid you can't elude me any longer. Allow me to properly introduce myself. The name is Bruno von Zehntner. Though judging by the expression on your face, you already know who I am. I honestly have to admit, it behooves me why you would play so hard to get, but it is an honor to finally meet your acquaintance, Mr. Tesla." The look that Tesla gave Bruno when he sighed and finally accepted defeat was like an old rival who had long since been 10 steps ahead of his opponent, only to find this adversary waiting for him at the finish line. Needless to say, when he finally spoke to Bruno, there was a hint of exasperation in his voice. "You are quite literally the most dedicated pursuer I have ever had in my life. I have to say, I am almost starting to think that you might fancy me." Bruno simply chuckled at this remark before rejecting the premise entirely. "Oh, I assure you I am quite happily married, my friend. It is not your heart that I desire, but your mind. Few men appreciate your genius, but me, I admire it. If you had just given me the chance of day to speak with you, I would have told you that your financial problems have come to an end. Isn't that the purpose of renting these offices? To gain investment in your future projects? I am willing to fund whatever project you are passionate about without expectation of returns. I have more than enough money to do so, after all." Nikola Tesla was indeed surprised to hear this, but like everything in life, he expected there to be some kind of catch. I mean, nobody in this world would throw money away at a pile of unproven and frankly far-fetched ideas without expecting some kind of return. In fact, one of the reasons he was having such trouble finding investors was because they were all concerned about the financial return of their investments. Because of this, the man quickly narrowed his eyes and demanded the truth of why Bruno was making such an absurd offer. "What exactly is your aim? You have come all this way across the Atlantic after years of pestering me for a meeting, and your first offer is unlimited financing towards whatever pursuit I am passionate about? What are you really after?" Naturally, Bruno was aware of the man's skepticism. Hell, if someone offered to throw an unlimited pile of money at him to finance his goals in life, he would also be skeptical. And because of this, Bruno dropped his friendly fa, and was immediately blunt with the man. "Everything I have said to you is true. I admire your intellect. Few men in history are as brilliant as you are, and even fewer as underappreciated as you are. But even so, I wouldn't exactly be telling the whole truth if I denied that I had ulterior motives. And you and I both know that you can easily tell this. So, allow me to be blunt with you. I want to secure your genius as an asset to the German Reich. I want you to immigrate to Germany, where you choose to live, and where you build your base of operations is of no concern to me. Hell, even if your ideals turn out to be abject failures, I really don't care. But I believe acquiring your genius will be an overall benefit for my people. And to me, the interests of the German Reich are worth the expense, even if I may personally never recover my investment into your scientific pursuits. Nikola Tesla was still skeptical, as he was quick to interrogate Bruno about what he said. You care so much about your fellow man that you would be willing to take such a financial risk merely for the potential of a brighter future for humanity? Bruno was quick to deny this while clarifying what he really meant in a way that finally convinced Tesla that he was being wholly honest in his assertions. My fellow man, God, no. I could not be compelled to care about the lives of the overwhelming majority of human beings on this planet. I am neither a saint nor an angel. But for my fellow Germans? Absolutely. Besides, my wealth is both vast and diverse enough that even if I threw money at you for the rest of your life, resulting in nothing but failures, I would still be secure enough to live the same life I am now. So what do you say? Will you come back with me to Germany, where together we can build a brighter future? Or will you stay here in America and become bankrupt when the war finally breaks out and the Americans shamelessly infringe on the patents you have already filed in Europe? This was a future that was indeed bound to happen. Americans would infringe on multiple patents during the war, but the end result was that they would be forced to pay compensation after it was over. And while patent infringement during a time of war was something the United States was willing to engage in, Bruno had no doubt they wouldn't dare seize his assets in the country, which included his stock shares in major American corporations. Because if they did so, there would be hell to pay for after the war was over. This, of course, was all contingent on the idea that America entered the war on behalf of the Allies in the first place, which Bruno hoped he would be able to prevent altogether. Either way, his words gave Nikola Tesla much to fear, as he would effectively be bankrupt if such a thing were to transpire. And because of this, he was quick to give Bruno a response, albeit not the one he was hoping for, yet the one he still expected. Can you give me some time to consider your offer? Having already anticipated this would be the outcome, Bruno was quick to agree to it, placing faith in the genius, and that he would choose what was ultimately best for himself, the German Reich, and by extension, the world altogether. Of course, take as much time as you need. I am in no hurry. This offer is indefinite. You could approach me in 20 years, and I would still gladly help you out. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I have no intention of interfering with your projects or any corporation you might build with my investment. You are free to use my money however you wish, in case you were perhaps worried that I might try to micromanage you, or, God forbid, suppress your genius. So do with that information what you will. I look forward to hearing from you in the future, Mr. Tesla. Until we meet again. After saying this, Bruno stood up and left Tesla's office, leaving the man with much to think about. Whether or not he would actually take up Bruno on his offer had yet to be seen, but Bruno was certain that he would, even if it took him another 20 years to do so. Chapter 160, Creating the Deutsche Luftstreicher, FTE. Bruno spent another 5 days at sea after meeting with Nikola Tesla before eventually returning home. Frankly speaking, he did not want to go to work the next day. But then again, he seldom got to choose his own hours. Duty and service were things that truly ended only with one's death. One always had a responsibility to their family, community, fatherland, monarch, and God. To shirk these obligations for the sake of rest was a sign of sloth. Such was one of the 7 deadly sins. Reasonably so, as laziness and its temptations had been the ruin of many a great man. Even worse, it was often a gateway to one's personal destruction, both in terms of their immortal soul and physical being. It was perhaps because of this that Bruno, despite being exhausted from the visit, made sure to spend some appropriate time with his wife and children, all of whom he loved very much, before eventually retiring for the evening at an appropriate hour. The next morning, he was up bright and early at the crack of dawn. Was he as well rested as he could reasonably be? No, not in the slightest. In fact, some form of minor fatigue lingered within his system until being replaced by a healthy dose of coffee. Bruno then kissed his pregnant wife on the cheek before heading back to the office. Upon arriving at the Central Division of the German Army's High Command, Bruno found himself at his desk before something peculiar popped up in front of him. One of his superiors, a field marshal whom Bruno both deeply respected and directly answered to, dropped a folder in front of him, speaking with a peculiar grin on his face. As a legendary Death's Head Hussar, August von Mackensen was perhaps what one would call a man exemplary of the cavalry spirit, riding through guns blazing on horseback into the fray, while wholly obsolete. It was a tradition of warfare that dated back thousands of years. Germanic cavalry was known to have played a critical role in Rome's utter humiliation at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. A battle so ingrained in German heritage that a statue of Arminius, otherwise known as Hermann the German, was erected in 1875 as a commemoration of their victory over the Romans. This battle ensured that the Germanic peoples were never fully Romanized, or even primarily so. Only a small portion of Germania was ever conquered and settled by the Romans, which was reclaimed by the various barbarian kingdoms after the fall of Rome in 476 AD, and to some extent preceding it. Perhaps because of this proud and ancient lineage of which General Feldmarschall von Mackensen had partaken during the early stages of his career, he had been most aggrieved by Bruno's insistence that the era of cavalry had come to an end. Initially, he had resisted the attempts to disband the overwhelming majority of cavalry units, relegating what little remained of them to the positions of scouts and forward observers. That is, until he witnessed the destructive nature of the new generation of warfare firsthand with the introduction of modern weaponry among the German army over the course of the last few years. The MG-34 alone made cavalry a suicidal position, one that had zero advantage on the battlefield as a combat unit. Then there was long-range artillery. While Bruno's tanks and armored cars were still largely under development, needing a few more years to work out the kinks, one particular vehicle was entering its prototype staging. This vehicle made August von Mackensen feel almost as if he were a young cavalry officer again, and it was that which the folder he handed Bruno contained information about. Thus, with a wide smirk on his face, the aging field marshal patted Bruno on the back and told him what he thought about the man. "You know, boy, I have been awfully sore about you destroying the role of cavalry in the army. But had I known what you had been planning all along, I would have supported you to the fullest extent early on." Bruno had more or less followed the course of history with the introduction of the He-51 biplane. By that, I mean he decided to retrain the cavalry units to become the world's first combat aviators. This was essentially what the Germans had done in his past life once airplanes entered service in the Great War, and the realization that cavalry was useless as a combat profession in the modern era finally dawned upon the great powers. These powers had stubbornly denied this objective reality for the course of half a century after they were proven woefully obsolete in the Crimean War. With the He-51 entering its prototype phase, Bruno had recently, shortly before his visit to Romania and the United States, introduced a request to begin reorganizing cavalry units from horseback to airplanes. The reorganization efforts were classified to the highest extent under the label of Das Projekt Azurblauer Ritter, or, in English, Project Azure Knight. This was a reference to the chivalrous tradition of cavalry units, who commonly saw themselves as the successors to the knights of old, as well as the blue tint of the sky in which they would fight on their new battlefield. After looking through the folder and seeing that his project was approved and that testing of the He-51, specifically the fighter/reconnaissance variant, had begun, Bruno smirked and made a snarky comment to his current boss. "If you had more trust in me, like the Kaiser does, then perhaps you would have realized I always planned to have a replacement for the cavalry. You can rest assured, as the Knights of the Sky, your legacy will live on in a new frontier. I wouldn't just disband the cavalry and throw them into the infantry. That would be insulting." August von Mackensen's expression was priceless as he grimaced at Bruno's words, stunned into silence for several seconds before walking off. But not before leaving behind a certain remark to Bruno about who he reminded him of. "You cunning little brat. You are just like your father." As the legendary field marshal stormed off, Bruno chuckled while hollering after him, making a comment that only further caused the man to seethe in silence. "I'll take that as a compliment." After which, Bruno shook his head while laughing as he read over the details in the folder and the new work he had been assigned. Essentially, he was now tasked with creating the world's first air force, which, much as it was known during his past life, was labeled under the term Deutsche Luftstreitkräfte. FT. Chapter 161. The First Night of the Sky. It had been years since Bruno first introduced his designs for the concept of a functional tank. What Bruno had conceptualized was a rough draft. It was based upon his knowledge of tanks from his past life, crudely drawn blueprints of a theoretical tank based upon a design from the Second World War during his past life, and of course, his own current functional knowledge of mechanical engineering. The thing was that creating machine guns, semi-automatic rifles, submachine guns, and artillery pieces was a hell of a lot easier than making armored vehicles, warships, submarines, and airplanes. While warships and submarines were theoretically easier for his naval engineers to comprehend, as they more or less already understood such concepts, armored vehicles and warplanes were brand new applications of warfare that nobody had really conceived until now, or at least had created a functional design. Bruno's basic concepts were, of course, revolutionary in this design, as he had 100+ years of developmental history stored away within his memory and thus had a preconceived notion of what worked and what didn't. But the rest of the world would be compelled to find this out the hard way, as they had in his past life. Even so, every component of these warplanes and armored vehicles was being designed from scratch. A semi-automatic 5 cm gun, for example, was not something within the current German inventory. The term semi-automatic was misleading to those familiar with small arms, but not artillery pieces. While a semi-automatic firearm meant that it fired with one function of the trigger and automatically ejected and loaded the next cartridge, it could not be fired if one continued to hold down the trigger, unlike automatic fire, or what was commonly referred to as fully automatic. Semi-automatic in terms of artillery and tank guns simply meant that upon firing the main gun of the armored vehicle, it would automatically eject the spent cartridge, where a new round would manually have to be loaded by the tank crew. This, in and of itself, was not exactly something currently employed by artillery and was seldom done so outside of anti-aircraft guns and armored vehicles. Even so, though Bruno may have given his engineers the basic principles behind its design and how it functioned, it was up to them to figure out how to make it a functional reality. The same overall process applied to pretty much every component of the 2 armored vehicles he had designed, as well as the airplanes and warships. In addition to this, Bruno had also more or less done the same with the 3.5-ton trucks he was producing for transportation of men from the rear echelons to the front line, as well as equipment. As a result, some of these things took longer to produce than others. It had been years since Bruno introduced the concept of the He-51 to his engineers, and even longer for the armored vehicles. Even now, the aircraft was the one with the first functional prototype, as it actually required fewer mechanical pieces to properly function. Its weapons were simply machine guns embedded into the fuselage and rigged up with a fire control system. As a result, Bruno was now looking at the first functional prototype of the He-51, which looked more or less like the final product from his previous life. Albeit without a proper coat of paint on it, Bruno intended to, of course, introduce aviation camouflage, as well as camouflage to his armored vehicles. It would be foolish not to do such a thing, considering the vast advantages it would give him compared to his opponents. For example, Bruno intended to later introduce the German late war intruder camouflage pattern for his aircraft, which saw service from 1944 onward during the Second World War of his past life. A pattern that proved to do its job quite well, all things considered. Whereas for armored vehicles, he planned to introduce the ambush pattern, which saw its adoption the same year. But right now, he saw a shiny aluminum fuselage sitting in his hangar bay, on the airbase he had personally constructed for testing this plane. Standing in front of him was a young cavalry officer who had volunteered to be the first test pilot. He had received extensive instruction on how to properly fly the plane. He was currently dressed in an experimental pilot uniform based upon designs used by the Luftwaffe during the Second World War of Bruno's past life. Albeit instead of the blue color which the Luftwaffe was renowned for, it had the standard Feldgrau of the Imperial German Army because at the end of the day, the Luftstreicher, FTE, was not a separate branch, but rather an extension of the German Army. After all, it was only under theoretical construction at the moment, and it would be years before it grew to such an extent in size and scale that it required to operate as an independent branch of the Imperial German military. Bruno, as well as several other generals of the German army, had gathered to witness this test flight of the world's first combat aircraft. This entire event was classified, and because of that, Bruno had established the airbase way out in the countryside. He had also ensured proper security was in place within a reasonable distance so that any attempt to observe or record the test flight would ultimately be in vain. Bruno saluted the cavalry officer, whose courage allowed him to test a highly theoretical, prototype aircraft of which nobody knew whether or not it would actually succeed or, God forbid, crash and burn. Either way, Bruno's words were an encouragement to the man and acted as commendation to his bravery and courage for volunteering for a position most would never consider, even if they were promised immense wealth in return. Lieutenant, I must say that you have shown exceptional bravery here today. Few men have what it takes to climb into that cockpit and test this experimental aircraft, which is well above and beyond the designs that the world has seen so far. I don't need to tell you the immense risk you are taking, as you are already all too aware. But nevertheless, you have my utmost respect and gratitude for the undertaking you are about to be a part of. All I can really say is Godspeed, my friend. His speech was short and to the point. After all, he did not want to give the man undue confidence that may result in him making a mistake that he otherwise would not make. Something that, while piloting an experimental aircraft, could easily cost him his life. Because of this, he saluted the man, who, after returning it, climbed into the cockpit of the He-51 prototype, where he ignited the engine and prepared for takeoff. Bruno quickly returned to the observation post, where the other generals were. They silently nodded to one another in recognition while staring unblinkingly at the airstrip where the experimental aircraft sat. Nobody said a word, as the atmosphere was far too dreadful. The anxiety was enough to cause a lesser man to break down as they silently said their prayers for the test's success, both for the sake of the brave man who had volunteered for this monumental undertaking, as well as for the future of the German military. In the end, after several minutes of unimaginable dread, the plane took to the skies, where cheers erupted both from the generals who had gathered to witness this occasion, as well as the crew and engineers who worked on the plane. The lieutenant performed a basic flight pattern around the airbase while giving a salute to the generals as he passed by their air traffic control tower, before eventually landing the plane safely. The first flight test of the He-51 had proven to be an enormous success. And when the Kaiser heard of this, he was so excited and impressed by this news that he gave the lieutenant a non-hereditary knighthood, referring to him in private circles as the first Knight of the Sky. Chapter 162. Ongoing developments in the land of the rising sun. Though the League of the Four Emperors had been established primarily as a result of Bruno's actions in this life, some of its members were closer than others. For example, Germany and Russia were on exceptional terms at the moment. Not only were the Kaiser and the Tsar related, but ever since Bruno had single-handedly caused the Russian Revolution to occur and also saved the House of Romanov, as well as the entirety of the Russian Empire, from the Bolshevik menace, the Tsar had begun doing everything he could to get on the good side of Germany. Currently, there were not only joint military exercises being held between the two countries, but there were also joint infrastructure projects being built. Not only were the railways being renovated and improved upon for the use of heavy armored trains, as well as the high-speed trains of the future, but even the road systems were being overhauled to facilitate transit via automobile traffic. Granted, Bruno had no plans to make cars and trucks the primary form of transportation for the German Reich, as public transportation methods such as trains, subways, and buses were far more ideal for the German environment. But at the same time, the use of personal vehicles for transportation was indeed something that was necessary, especially considering carrying cargo via aircraft was still decades away. Thus, the transportation of goods across the German Reich and its allies would be required to be carried via railway and highway. And while Austro-Hungary was also involved in this massive infrastructure initiative, of which the three empires were primarily contracting Bruno's businesses to complete the work, the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns were not ever likely to truly get along. Sure, Germany and Austro-Hungary were neighbors and allies. That was natural considering the nature of the world at the moment. But Germans had a tendency to hold grudges for a very long time. Wars had been waged, assassinations had occurred, and centuries of conflict between the two noble houses who had spent countless resources trying to unite Germany under their banner in preceding centuries was not exactly something that could be resolved in a single lifetime. Perhaps because there was a lack of familial ties between the two houses, the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans were not as friendly at the moment as the Russians and Germans were. Even so, the relationship was amicable and trustworthy enough not to fear any form of betrayal in the immediate future. The Empire of Japan, however, was a different story. Blood had been spilled between them and the Russians only recently, and unlike Bruno, who had redeemed himself in the eyes of the House of Romanov and the Russian people, Emperor Meiji was still seen in a bad light by the Tsar and his empire. For starters, the Japanese were a foreign people from the Far East. And in this day of excessive nationalism and ethnic pride, it was not like they were regarded as equals to the European powers. To an extent, this sentiment could be considered accurate. Over the course of the last few centuries, ever since the age of exploration began, the European powers spread to every jungle, every desert, and every inhospitable wasteland around the world and claimed it as their own, gaining victory after victory against anyone who resided where they planted their flag. When it came to military prowess, only a European power could challenge another European power. This had been the way ever since the Europeans mastered the use of gunpowder. The only exception to this was Japan. Only recently had a European power been defeated, and that was the Russians, who had lost to the Japanese. They were at most considered upstarts who had beaten the backwater of Europe in the Far East by many of the European rulers and people. This lack of willingness to treat the Japanese as equals, despite carving out their own sizable empire on the other side of the world, had angered the Empire of Japan, especially its leadership. Sure, they were offered a place in Germany's new military alliance, something they were glad to accept. But the distance between them and the German Reich, as well as all these other previous issues discussed, did not favor strengthening relationships between the two powers beyond ideological similarities and economic necessity. Or I should say that would normally have been the case. But there was one distinctive factor that tied Germany to Japan in a way that nobody had anticipated. And that was Bruno. You see, Bruno had made a mark on Emperor Meiji. More specifically, he had impressed the man with his performance in Manchuria, as well as his insights into warfare. Even more so, Bruno offered Japan a grand gift that Emperor Meiji did not know how to repay. He had given them insight into the future of weaponry. Though he said a few words here and there regarding how machine guns would, by the very nature of their use, evolve in the coming decades. Emperor Meiji had taken these words to heart and tasked his engineers with coming up with something based upon the recommendations Bruno had made. The Japanese had a rather impressive ability to make domestic military equipment and had done so to a rather absurd extent in Bruno's past life. What I mean by this is that pretty much every nation that was either not called the United States of America or was not a major European power simply purchased weapons from either of the two or licensed the domestic manufacture of weapons designed in those two regions. Japan was the most notable exception to this general rule of the era. While many of their weapons were loosely based upon those used in Europe at the time, they were very different in many ways. It was perhaps because of this that Japanese equipment had proven to be primarily lacking when compared with the weapons used by the Americans during the war in the Pacific. And it was also likely to be the reason they had a very different doctrine than the Western powers. While pretty much every nation of the war, other than Japan, fielded some kind of belt-fed machine gun, the Japanese relied on heavy machine guns loosely based upon the World War I-era French Hotchkiss, which used a rather inefficient rigid feed strip that was almost like a clip, but not necessarily. Because of this design, its ability to continuously feed without the need for reloading was diminished, to say the least, bringing down the practical rate of fire significantly. And while they were not using these heavy machine guns, they were using either brand like magazine-fed light machine guns or something called the Type 11 that had a bizarre feed design that made use of Arisaka stripper clips stacked on top of one another. Either way, like their armored vehicles, they had never really designed a machine gun properly suited for the war, which could explain why they ultimately lost to the Americans in pretty much every land battle fought in the Pacific, outside of those waged very early on before the Americans could fully muster their wrath. Bruno had more or less changed this, resulting in a prototype belt-fed, air-cooled machine gun with a detachable barrel, chambered in 6.5 times 50 MSR Arisaka. Frankly speaking, the gun was more or less a belt-fed variation of the Type 96, resulting in the weapon looking oddly similar to the BSA GPMG, which itself was little more than a belt-fed conversion of the Bren machine gun that the Type 96 was loosely based upon. Or more specifically, the ZB-36, which the Bren was based upon. Functionally speaking, the weapon was more efficient than its past-life counterpart, which it slightly resembled. It was more aesthetically pleasing, at least to Bruno's sense, should he have been present to witness its creation. If used in the upcoming Great War, this weapon could prove to be not necessarily an equal to the German MG-34, but vastly superior to the heavy machine guns employed by the Allies. And when Emperor Meiji saw the first semi-functional machine gun prototype that he had invested heavily into over the course of the last 4 to 5 years since receiving Bruno's advice, he couldn't help but say his thoughts aloud. It would appear I owe that man a great debt of gratitude. Perhaps I should extend him a letter of invitation to witness what his thoughts have given birth to. Anyone who had heard what the Japanese emperor had said did not respond to him, as they knew he was speaking to himself. Instead, the project creator was quick to boast of the weapon's capabilities. Compared to what the European powers are beginning to field, this weapon is vastly superior. We have acquired copies of the French machine gun, and it is not only significantly heavier than our new prototype, but we also suspect it will be far less reliable than ours once the completed design has been finalized. While the weapon is far from ready to begin military trials, we are going to be performing some basic tests with it later this afternoon, if Your Majesty would like to be present too. Witness its first function tests. Emperor Meiji quickly looked over at the engineer who said this, and smirked as he smiled, voicing his agreement to the invitation as he did so. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Chapter 163, Rewarding Thyself. Bruno was at home following his day's work. He had been extremely busy following the establishment of the Deutsche Luftstreiche, FT. Though Bruno was not the one to become the acting general in charge of the unit, he was the one trusted with organizing it. After all, the planes that were to be used were more or less his brainchild. And if he had such advanced knowledge of aerospace engineering, then surely he would have some idea of how to use them on the battlefield, right? Well, that was actually a correct assumption, even if it wasn't the most logically sound in terms of reasoning. Bruno did indeed have some understanding of aerial warfare. Not because he served in the Air Force in his past life, but he was what one might call a military history buff and knew all about the tactics used by various militaries and their branches throughout history, especially modern history. Frankly speaking, it would be many years before the Luftstreiche, FT, grew to such an extent that it could be considered its own branch. Even so, Bruno made full preparations for this. Technically speaking, the WW2-era German Luftwaffe, which was the successor of the Deutsche Luftstreiche, FTE, was its own branch and, as a result, had 3 of its own sub-branches. Those were the flying troops, the anti-aircraft artillery, and the air signal troops. These were, of course, even more subdivided into smaller roles. But this was how Bruno decided to set up the responsibilities of the Deutsche Luftstreiche, FTE, in this life. First and foremost were the flying troops, who would be made up of the existing cavalry ranks, or more specifically those cavalry officers who could pass basic flight school, which, in and of itself, was something Bruno also began establishing dedicated military flight schools. Then there were the anti-aircraft artillery units, which were much like their land-based counterparts, just under the authority of the Deutsche Luftstreiche, FT. Their role was fairly self-explanatory. Use the anti-aircraft weaponry Bruno had designed to blow enemy aircraft out of the skies. Finally, there were the air signal troops, who were critical as they were the ones in charge of air traffic communication and coordination of information between pilots, the anti-aircraft artillery, the ground forces, and pretty much anyone else remotely within the operational structure. Naturally, there were, of course, other critical areas, such as maintenance crews, divisional headquarters, logistical supply networks, etc., that he all had to come up with in preparation for the war, none of which currently existed. All things considered, Bruno was amazed that the great powers had all organized this kind of thing on the fly during the Great War, as the idea of a military air force only came into existence midway through the conflict. Bruno felt that after spending 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, for months on end, he was perhaps lucky for the stress he was undergoing at the moment. The reason being that he actually had 6 years to prepare all of this for the start of the war. Whereas the enemy would most likely be scrambling during the initial days to get all of this set up from scratch. Because the overwhelming advantage of air supremacy would become apparent to the enemy the moment the war broke out. Thus, after months of hard work, Bruno had finally concluded all of his efforts today and decided to celebrate his freedom by having an extra stiff drink, breaking out the hard liquor as he sat at his dining table with his beloved family and rejoiced with them. I will tell you, you have no idea the amount of paperwork I have had to do these past few months. I was quite honestly a few days away from going mad. But with the system I set up, I'm sure the general staff can find a suitable man to take over from here on out. So, now that I finally have the time, how about you tell me all how you have been? Heidi did not immediately speak. She decided to let her children speak of what they had been up to as of late. With the youngest of them being old enough to begin entering school, and her husband at work most of the day, she had actually been rather lonely as of late. A problem that would resolve itself when the child she was currently carrying in her womb came to term, as she would then have another child to baby. Meanwhile, Eva, the youngest of the 3 rugrats, was quick to speak about her day at school and all that she had learned about. The girl was more or less a social butterfly, gaining many friends. She, of course, went to an aristocratic all-girls school, and perhaps because of this, she was popular. The von Zehntner name held quite a bit of influence these days, both because of Bruno's father's accomplishments in politics, his eldest brother's success in business, and also because of his own personal feats on the battlefield. And when the girls learned that Eva was a literal Russian princess, her popularity increased even more among her classmates. The girl was a bit of a blabbermouth, speaking long enough that Bruno finally had to tell her to give it a rest so that her siblings could speak. Erwin, being the second youngest of Bruno's 3 current children who had been born, spoke of his time at the boys' academy. Like the ones his sisters went to, it was a school for the noble elite of Prussia. Bruno had wanted to send the boy to a military school, but Heidi threw a fit when he tried to do so. He could tell that was an argument he was going to lose when she said, "There is no way on God's green earth you are sending my only baby boy to a boarding school. I will take you to hell with me before I ever give you a chance to do so." Considering the woman's temper was frightening when provoked, especially when it revolved around her family, Bruno had decided to drop the matter and send the boy to a non-boarding school while still being an elite private establishment. Either way, Erwin's education would be the best he could possibly receive, yet he would not get to properly understand the military culture as Bruno had desired his son to do so. Then again, upon seeing the boy smiling while talking about the friends he had made at school, all while Heidi lovingly doted on the boy by adding more food onto his plate, Bruno thought that perhaps this was ultimately for the best. Eventually, Elsa spoke about her experience with schooling. As she was in the youngest year, she was less excited about the whole educational experience and more aggrieved that she had to go in the first place. Of course, Bruno tried to console the girl, as he was often one to dote on his beloved daughters. "Elsa, I won't sugarcoat things for you. School is incredibly dull, but it is a rewarding experience, and they will teach you things that you have to know in this life. You have made some friends, haven't you?" Elsa nodded her head meekly. She was rather ashamed that she had spoken so poorly about school when her father spoke in such endearing terms about it. One of the things she loved about her father was that he would not just outright lie to her. School was boring. He knew that she knew that, and he wasn't going to try to say it wasn't. But he also made sure she understood the value of school and that it was ultimately worthwhile to go to. Heidi, of course, damn near snorted at Bruno's remarks. She was all too aware that the boy genius never had to go to school, as his parents flew in the Reich's greatest minds to personally tutor him on anything he had not studied in his own time and still desired to learn. The two of them had grown up together, and she would be lying if she said she did not envy the overwhelming expense that Bruno's parents had paid to ensure that the boy's educational needs were met, considering the uniqueness of his brilliance. The fact that he had never experienced school life, like she had and like their children were currently undergoing, yet had the gall to say it was a rewarding and worthwhile experience, was a level of shamelessness that made it difficult not for Heidi to break out into laughter. It took all of her strength not to do so, as she knew it would complicate the lesson the man was trying to teach their youngest daughter, who was throwing a hissy fit about going to school. Bruno could tell by the look on his wife's face that she was silently mocking him, and had no doubt he would hear all about her thoughts regarding his statement later that night when they were alone together. But what Heidi didn't know was that Bruno had actually experienced school life, just in his past life, and not the current one. He was wholly familiar with what went on in those hallowed halls of education, even if what he had experienced was separated by decades from the current year and, by extension, an entirely unfamiliar culture. Ultimately, Bruno would continue to spend the evening with his family, much in the way he always did, even now in their luxurious estate, before ultimately retiring for the night with his beloved wife. Tomorrow he would wake up to find a rather interesting letter in the mail, one which would summon him far away from home once more. But in the meantime, he could enjoy his current blissful life, one which helped heal his wounded mind. Chapter 164, Elsa's Birthday Part 1. Bruno did not immediately answer the request to visit Japan, or more specifically its capital, to meet with the ruling dynasty of Japan. Rather, he would do so at his own leisure. It was nothing urgent and could wait for some time. Emperor Meiji had sent a letter that traversed by sea and railway to the German Reich, requesting Bruno to visit and witness what his passing thoughts had given birth to, a rather exceptional machine gun for the time. It was something that was most certainly superior to anything fielded by the Imperial Japanese Army in his past life. Or at least it had the potential to become such a weapon once it had gone through proper prototyping, experimentation, and so forth. It had taken roughly 4 years for the German Reich to go from the conceptual stage to passing military trials for the small arms Bruno had given them. But that was because Bruno had provided them with a very detailed understanding of what to make, while the German Reich's engineers, especially those at Bruno's family's factories, had a capable knowledge of machine guns already. Whereas Japan had yet to field its own domestically manufactured machine gun, relying instead on designs built by foreign powers for the limited use they saw during the Russo-Japanese War. The fact that they had only just begun prototyping a little over 4 years into development was rather usual for arms manufacturing. Bruno suspected whatever they had to boast about would not remotely resemble the same product once it reached its final stages of development, trial, and manufacture. Because of this, he was more than willing to put off this meeting, which was merely an excuse for a diplomatic visit to Japan at the behest of the Japanese emperor. Something he would normally jump at the opportunity for. So then why was he so adamant about not immediately responding? Because it was his youngest daughter's birthday today, and he had no intention of leaving his home under any circumstances. Unless it was something like an all-out civil war requiring his command to put down, Bruno would not be leaving his estate today. Elsa had, of course, used this occasion, which only happened once a year, to gain as much affection from her father as possible, who, unlike her mother, was commonly out of the home from the earliest hours of the morning until the final hours of the evening. And that was assuming he was actually in Berlin and not on some diplomatic meeting elsewhere, or, God forbid, a deployment overseas. Because of this, Elsa was constantly around her father, even when her friends and extended family all visited the estate to celebrate her birthday. Only Heidi could compel the girl to go socialize with her classmates, as her tyranny was something the young girl deeply feared. It was only after Heidi approached the girl who was sitting on her father's lap, while happily chatting with him, that Elsa fled off into the distance to properly greet her guests. Elsa von Zehntner, you have been hiding away from your friends and cousins for far too long. You can't just keep clinging to your father all day like a little leech. Go greet your guests and have some fun this instant. Or so help me God, I will go find a wooden spoon. Elsa pouted at her father with pleading eyes, silently begging the man to forestall his wife's wrath. But Bruno simply chuckled and shook his head. He had enjoyed spending time with his children, as it was something he often didn't have as much time to dedicate to as he might have desired. But ultimately, the girl's mother was right. She needed to properly socialize with her guests. And hence, Bruno picked the girl up off his lap and stood her down in front of him, where he got on his knees and patted her silky strawberry blonde hair. Out of all of his children, she was the only one who did not have a golden head. Though which of her parents she had actually inherited it from, Bruno didn't really know, as both Heidi and he were carriers of red hair. At least 2 of Bruno's 8 brothers had red hair, while several of his uncles and aunts had it as well. The same could be said for Heidi and her half-siblings, as well as her cousins, uncles, aunts, etc. Frankly speaking, the little girl probably got it from both of them. The simple act of petting the girl's hair with an affectionate gaze was all that was needed to get her to comply with her father's wishes without complaint. Even if she had just moments ago silently pleaded with the man otherwise, all with tears in her azure, blue eyes. Elsa, today is your special day, and everyone wants to wish you a very happy birthday. I will be here waiting for you after they have all gone home. But now is the time to go be with your friends and well-wishers. So, be a good girl and go have fun. All right, baby girl? Elsa immediately smiled and hugged her father before running off, promising to do exactly as he said. Meanwhile, Heidi stared at the man pouting with her arms crossed. She refused to say a word to him until he dragged her into his arms and kissed her forehead, the size difference between the two of them being quite adorable to the onlookers as he did so. What? Are you perhaps angry that she doesn't listen to your scoldings? Heidi honestly couldn't stay mad at Bruno when he acted so romantically with her, let alone showed off his good side as a father. She knew all too well the man was battling with some inner demons due to all the horrific things he had seen on the battlefield. And she also knew that he suppressed those demons every time he was home, making sure that his children never saw the haunted side of him. For him to go through such lengths for the sake of their family was something she deeply admired about him. Thus, any resistance she had toward Elsa obeying his words and not hers immediately crumbled as she melted in his arms, letting him have his way. Fine, I don't mind playing the role of the bad guy so long as you keep being such a benevolent father to those little brats. Bruno broke out into a hearty bellow of laughter as he hugged the woman tightly from behind and kissed her on the cheek before whispering something in her ear that turned her face red with embarrassment. You're absolutely adorable when you're angry. Did you know that? Heidi felt like she was going to pass out from embarrassment as many of their friends and family gazed upon the two of them acting so shamelessly in public, ultimately forcing herself away from Bruno's arms while making some excuse to escape from his grasp. I'm going to go check on the kitchen staff. If they have started preparing the cake without me, I swear to God I'm going to tear them a new one. Bruno laughed and shook his head as the love of his life scurried off like a frightened little rabbit. It was only after she was gone that 3 of his brothers approached him. 2 of them, Bruno had grown up enduring their abuse before eventually burying the hatchet altogether and forging an unbreakable bond as brothers in arms in Russia, Ludwig and Kurt. The third was a brother Bruno had seldom seen since becoming an adult. Out of Bruno's 8 older brothers, he was more or less on speaking terms with 4 of them, Ludwig, Kurt, Christoph, and Franz. The other 4 he only ever saw at the annual family gatherings or during other rare important family events, like campaigning for their father or Ludwig's election. Maximilian was the 3rd oldest of Bruno's brothers. He was one of the 2 red-headed siblings that Bruno had. But unlike Elsa, who had her father and mother's sky-blue eyes, he had an almost mint-green eye color. The man had mid-length hair that was properly styled in a respectable fashion, and like most members of Bruno's family, he was clean-shaven. Though he was quickly approaching his 40s, he didn't look a day over 30. Slow aging was a common occurrence in Bruno's family, with Bruno himself approaching the 30-year mark but looking half a decade or more younger, even with his unhealthy coping habits. He and his siblings most certainly got this slow aging gene from their mother, who even now, in her mid-50s, looked not a day older than 40. In fact, his mother had married very young, as was common in the era, having been married off to their father when she was in her mid-teenage years. She had 9 sons over the course of 9 years and was in her mid-20s when she had Bruno, the last of her children. Their father, however, was roughly 30 at the time of Bruno's birth, making him around the age of 60 currently. He, unlike his wife and children, looked his own age. And because of this, people commonly mistook his wife for the wife of his eldest son rather than himself. Either way, Bruno was most certainly surprised that Maximilian had decided to approach him with 2 of his other brothers. If Max was approaching him now, it meant the red-headed bastard required something of Bruno. Thus, he stood there waiting for the man to make his request of him on the day of his daughter's birthday. 165 Elsa's Birthday Part 2. Bruno didn't exactly hate his brothers, or at least those who he was still not necessarily on good terms with. Ludwig and Kurt had redeemed themselves in his eyes. Not that the man really took their childhood bullying to heart, as children often lacked the manners, discipline, and overall intelligence to behave themselves accordingly. It was only natural that their own sense of inferiority would compel them to lash out against him. Such was the nature of the inferior, or such was Bruno's perspective throughout his life. But those two men had fought and bled alongside Bruno in the trenches of the Russian Civil War, an experience that had caused them to grow by more than a decade in a single year. Any past grievances Bruno may have held against them were buried with the Red Army, and because of this, he was quite friendly with these two brothers. As for Christoph and Franz, they were old enough to have very little contact with Bruno as a child. Franz was already in high school by the time Bruno was 5. He couldn't be compelled to care about some little brat a decade younger than him. The same could be said for Christoph, who saw the bullying that Bruno underwent as the matters of little children that he couldn't care to intervene in. Maximilian was different, however. Perhaps it was because of the old joke that gingers have no souls. But even though he was in his early teenage years when Bruno was but a toddler, he had always been a right royal cunt. This behavior had persisted even into adulthood, with Maximilian taking every chance he could get to speak ill of Bruno, his wife, and his children. Frankly speaking, the hostility Maximilian had always shown Bruno stemmed from his disapproval of the man marrying a bastard girl. He had more or less believed that Bruno's engagement and later marriage to Heidi was a stain on their family's short-lived noble heritage. Even in a family that had gained its aristocratic status no more than 3 generations prior, there would always be some privileged twat among their ranks who thought they were better than everyone else because of it. And that spoiled prick was Maximilian. Max had more or less coasted through life on the family's finances and influence, getting a comfortable, high-paying job as a government bureaucrat where it didn't really matter whether or not he did his job well, or really at all. Bureaucracy was the death of civilization. It always led to bloat and overspending. Bruno was entirely convinced that the German government could axe a solid 50% of the German federal government and its employees, and the Reich could still function as it was supposed to, if not increase in overall efficiency. And if the German Reich had these problems, then the old government from the world he had previously lived in was plagued with it to a fatal degree. It was perhaps because Maximilian was one such useless individual that Bruno just couldn't find the ability to respect the man, even if they were related. Actually, their blood relation was perhaps an even greater reason that his opinion of his elder brother was right on the border of the outright despicable. While Maximilian looked down on Bruno, believing the man had brought shame to their family for marrying a bastard, Bruno himself thought the same of Maximilian, only for a very different reason. And it was the fact that Maximilian was just utterly useless as a human being. His worth and value were so little that Bruno would quite frankly use the man as cannon fodder if he could. At least his death could prove useful in shielding someone far more valuable from a similar fate. It was with all of this in mind that Bruno approached his other 2 brothers, Ludwig and Kurt, and hugged them both, saying a lot of flattery while ignoring Maximilian entirely. "Ludwig, Kurt, I'm glad you could make it. I hope it wasn't too much to ask you both to come all this way to celebrate my little girl's birthday." Bruno did not even dignify Maximilian with a single glance, instead conversing with his other 2 brothers as if he didn't exist in the slightest. Something which, of course, only caused the man to become sullen and bitter. Meanwhile, Ludwig and Kurt were quick to accept Bruno's friendly statements, while also trying to defuse whatever bomb the man was trying to detonate between himself and their elder brother. "Relax, I always enjoy a drive out to the country. The biggest hassle would have had to be the security, but I understand your reasons for going through such lengths. I'm glad we made it in time. My daughters always enjoy spending time with yours. Anyway, Bruno, Max wanted to have a word with you. He says he has stumbled across a good investment opportunity and wanted to see if you were perhaps interested." At the mention of his elder brother's name, and the fact that the man had come to him for money, Bruno sighed and rolled his eyes, bluntly making a remark that he knew was not exactly kind and loud enough that Maximilian could easily overhear it. "Of course it's about money. Why else would the useless twat put the 2 of you up to this? Has he already spoken to father or our elder brothers about this matter?" Ludwig and Kurt were smart enough to know that Bruno was using his father and his elder brothers as a way to figure out if Maximilian was simply trying to scam him or not. Because obviously, if this was a legitimate investment opportunity, either of those three would come before him. And if he did go to their father or their two eldest brothers, and the three of them rejected Max, then it could only mean that whatever Maximilian was trying to get him to invest in was at worst a bad offer, and at best an outright scam. Ludwig and Kurt were just about to answer the question when Maximilian's impatience reached its limit, forcing his way into the conversation as he adjusted his tie, trying his best to act friendly while masking the fury contained within his eyes. If you want to know whether or not I brought this opportunity to anyone else, then I assure you that you, little brother, are the first man I thought of. After all, you have done quite well for yourself these last few years, turning the small fortune that Franz gave you into a sizable profit. Why wouldn't I seek your investment before anyone else? Bruno narrowed his eyes at Max's words. Though it was subtle, Bruno detected the intentional insult contained between the lines of what he had said. Franz didn't give Bruno a small fortune. He paid Bruno a small fortune as proper compensation for the work Bruno had done designing various weapons for their family's company that had already netted them a massive profit. Whether it was that initial payment or all the wealth he had received since via his various investments and enterprises, it was insulting to say that the current fortune he had was merely the result of a handout. Sure, Bruno may already have an understanding of how the future markets of the world would go and what trends they would follow, which gave him a monumental advantage over his competitors. But he hadn't just sat on his ass and collected the money. A lot of work went into making himself one of the wealthiest men in the world. Much of his free time was spent managing these affairs, so much so that it was almost like a second job. Because of this, Bruno frowned, but he did not immediately fire back at Maximilian. After all, there was a very small chance that Maximilian had actually stumbled upon something worthwhile, and even if it was such a minute possibility that most people would rather spit in his face for the satisfaction. Bruno was intelligent enough to put aside whatever hostile emotions he may be currently feeling and entertain his brother's offer, at least long enough to discover what it was all about. If it turned out to be a scam or just something foolhardy altogether, Bruno would then lash out at the man for his insults and, more importantly, for wasting time on what he considered to be a very important day. Hence why he ultimately bit his tongue before inviting the man into his office. All right, fine, I'll give you 30 minutes of my time, but not a moment more. Today is a rather important day for my family, and I can't be gone for too long. Let's head into my office. Maximilian had a rather smug expression on his face as he followed Bruno out from the gardens and into his palace-like mansion. Meanwhile, Ludwig and Kurt looked at each other with somber gazes, believing that whatever private discussion was about to be had between their two brothers was going to end with a gruesome and brutal scene. Hence why they sighed heavily and shook their heads before ultimately Ludwig was quick to act. I'll go find Heidi and give her a heads up. You go get our father. Kurt did not say a word. Rather, he silently nodded his head in agreement before the two men went running off. They had roughly 30 minutes at most, after which Bruno would most likely tell Maximilian to suck a fat cock before a fight broke out. And if that happened, there was no telling what lengths Bruno would go to in order to teach his arrogant, spoiled, wastrel of an older brother a valuable and painful lesson, one that he may never forget. 166 Elsa's Birthday Part 3. Bruno walked to his personal office within his estate. It was a room that only he was permitted to enter. Anyone else who wished to enter would first be required to have been given his express permission to do so. Even his beloved wife could only knock on the door outside and request entry. The reason for this was simple. Bruno's workload was massive, and he needed a quiet and solitary place free from distraction to conduct his business outside of his employment as a Generaloberst in the Imperial German Army. With 3 young children who were liable to go running through rooms screaming and hollering like a bunch of howler monkeys whenever they got a little too rambunctious, it was no wonder that Bruno established these rules and made them very clear to both his family and the staff who lived and worked out of the massive and luxurious estate. This was where Bruno led Maximilian, partially because he wanted to be away from the ongoing festivities while discussing potential business with the man, but also because if he needed to teach his elder brother a painful yet valuable lesson about wasting his precious time, then there would be nobody to come to his rescue until Bruno was done with him. Without even realizing it, Maximilian had walked straight into a jaguar's den and sat across from the beast himself with a conceited smile on his face. Bruno listened intently to what the man had to say. He was more than willing to give his elder brother a chance to impress him, even if he personally thought very little of the man. Maximilian started the conversation with pointless flattery, which might work for those ancient nobles who loved to have their asses kissed, but from Bruno's perspective, it was a complete and total waste of his valuable time. I have to say, little brother, you have done quite well for yourself. This estate is really something else. I would say it is at least 2 to 3 times bigger than the one we grew up in. Your family is also quite. As Maximilian blathered on with pointless pleasantries, Bruno looked at his watch and quickly tapped it with a stern look on his face. His voice became ever more callous as he spoke to the man with an air of indifference about him. You have wasted 5 minutes already. That means you have 25 left. If I were you, I would cut the shit and get straight to the point, as I don't have much time to waste, seeing as how it is my beloved daughter's birthday. Bruno emphasized the beloved part of his statement to let Maximilian know that whatever shit he might be thinking internally about his family and their status, he better not say. Because of this, the man sighed heavily before revealing his hand. All right, fine. If you're going to be that way, I won't bother being polite. Fine. Bruno, I'll make it simple. I want you to invest a substantial sum into a certain business proposal. By chance, I happen to come across some information related to a patent that is currently being processed. It has the potential to revolutionize the world. With my connections at the patent office, I could easily have it stalled long enough to steal it right from under the creator, or at the very least have some chemists come up with a viable alternative. Hell, I could even have it outright rejected. All I need is your help funding the startup costs. Together, we can make untold fortunes off of this new plastic business. Bruno frowned immediately when he heard what his brother had dared to say in his presence. First and foremost, it made sense now why this bastard came to him. Such a sinister plot to steal intellectual property from someone else would never have gained the approval of their father or older brothers. And in fact, it could have had severe consequences for the man. Bruno frankly found it insulting that Maximilian had actually dared to come to him, thinking he was as low and despicable as the man himself. But more importantly, Bruno was agitated because those patents more or less belonged to him. What he was talking about was the creation of Bakelite, the first synthetic plastic in the world. Originally invented in some primitive form by Adolf von Bayer in 1872, it was initially believed to have no real commercial applications and thus was relatively forgotten about until just a year or two prior when the process was improved upon and perfected by a Belgian chemist by the name of Leo Baekeland. He applied for patents that year, which were currently ongoing, and because Maximilian worked for the German Reich's patent office, he naturally learned of this fact and wanted to take advantage of it, having just enough foresight to realize how profitable such a material could prove to be. There was just one problem. Baekeland was one of many scientists, like Nikola Tesla, who Bruno had long since scouted out and brought under his own investment and influence. Unlike in his past life, Baekeland did not live in the United States, but as a result of Bruno's patronage, had immigrated to the German Reich, where he filed the patent for Bakelite. In fact, Bruno had gotten Baekeland and other famous chemists from the era, who also specialized in plastics and other materials science, to come together as the primary researchers for a single corporation dedicated to their creation. To put it simply, Maximilian had come to Bruno to borrow money to invest in a company that would infringe on intellectual property he owned, just so they could become a competitor. Plastics were a major enterprise, one which Bruno was currently having a monopoly on, as patents were currently being filed for a variety of plastics, not just Bakelite, but also things like polyethylene and polyvinyl chloride. As the years spent developing these materials with the funding Bruno provided, the chemists had borne fruit. Because of this ironic twist of fate, Bruno couldn't help but break out into laughter after hearing his brother's sheer audacity, where he was quick to stand up and intimidate the man with an overtly hostile glare. I have to say, all these years, I knew there was a reason I kept you alive. You truly know how to play the part of the fool. Did you know that? I mean, you have misunderstood more than just my character. Did you seriously think that I would latch onto the first opportunity to make an illicit profit via theft of intellectual property? Am I so lowly in your eyes that you do not perceive me as having the honor and integrity of our father and brothers? Well, you were mistaken, and not just in regards to myself as a person, but also in the fact that this patent you are trying to infringe upon, I own the company that filed it. You probably would have known this interesting fact if greed had not taken such control of your mind that you did not even look into the matter more than a mere cursory glance. I find it truly ironic, after all the things you have said about me, my wife, and my children over the years. You, the mighty noble scion, would stoop so low as to theft, and would even have the audacity to approach the man you are trying to steal from and to ask him to invest in your criminal enterprise. I think God is having a laugh at you, brother, but don't worry, I won't inform the authorities of your unlawful conduct. No, I think our family is humiliated enough by having such a wretched son among its ranks. To bring such shame to the public eye, it would honestly be too cruel to our parents who sired such an amoral bastard. Don't you think? Bruno was using the term bastard rather loosely here to imply a lack of moral character rather than questionable heritage. Either way, being called a bastard by his youngest brother, and a man who had married a bastard, no less, it instantly caused Maximilian's smug smirk to come off of his otherwise handsome face. Or it would have, had he not been so dumbstruck by Bruno's admission. But before he could respond, Bruno looked at his watch and realized that the hand had just struck the 30-minute mark. He quickly shooed his elder brother from his office and assured him he was welcome to stay for the celebrations that were to be had, albeit implying that he and his family would be heavily watched by the estate's security. I am afraid that is all the time I have for you, brother. Do stay and enjoy the cake and festivities. You are more than welcome here in my home. You are family, after all. Though if I were you, I wouldn't be too keen on starting trouble. My patience has its limits, and the guards are a bit overprotective of my family, if you get what I mean. We wouldn't want you and your family overstaying your welcome and being forcibly removed from my home in front of so many guests, now would we? I'm afraid that would be a scene that people would be talking about for years to come, now wouldn't they? After shutting the door behind him and locking his office before stashing the key away in his pocket, Bruno walked away with a rather jovial gait in his step, humming a tune as he did so, one that only he was aware of its origin. Maximilian, of course, curled his fist in wrath but stayed his anger as he knew making a scene here and now would only result in further shame. He had never been so humiliated before in his life and did not know what to do now that his hopes to steal a fortune away from those who deserved it had been dashed before his very eyes. Ultimately, he would return to his own family and force them to leave Bruno's estate early, having no desire to stay and endure such a grievance. Chapter 167. When you do things right. Heidi quickly found Bruno almost immediately after he finished his meeting with Maximilian. It was obvious to her that her husband was in a rather good mood, which was not the least of what she was expecting. Upon seeing his pregnant and loving wife concerned about him, Bruno grabbed her hand and twirled her around in a brief dance-like maneuver before hugging her close and kissing her. The act was even more unexpected than his gleeful demeanor, causing Heidi to make a comment on it. I'm surprised that a simple conversation with your brother could make you so happy. Is there something I should know about? Bruno chuckled as he petted the woman's silky gold hair before enlightening her about the conversation he had and why he was in such a good mood. That scoundrel actually tried to steal from me, but I put him in his place. It's all good. Besides, I leave him only to find my lovely and beautiful wife scurrying after me in a hurry. Why wouldn't I be happy? Were you so worried about me that you must do such a thing? Shouldn't you be in the kitchen ensuring our daughter's cake is properly made? Heidi was indeed a bit embarrassed upon hearing such a thing. She honestly expected Maximilian to try something foolish and, in doing so, enrage Bruno. But he was instead in a good mood. It was truly a bit humiliating, as she had so brazenly run away from Bruno not long prior, citing a need to check on the kitchen staff. Yet here she was, no more than an hour later, in the process of running after him. Yet she couldn't be mad at Bruno. In fact, Heidi was certain that simply wasn't possible for her. Instead, she spoke about what the security had told her. I ran across Paul earlier. He said that your brother Maximilian had dragged his wife and children out of the estate in a hurry. His face was red, so no doubt you must have given him quite the slap in the face for him to act so disgracefully. Are you sure everything will be all right? Bruno shook his head and sighed before admitting getting along with Maximilian was unlikely to occur and overall was a foolish endeavor to aspire to. Unfortunately, even as brothers, I don't believe there is anything in this world that will ever compel the two of us to get along. God himself could descend from the heavens and decree it thus. Yet Maximilian, I fear, would stubbornly refuse such a heavenly demand. He is a foul wretch of low cunning and ruthless character. And frankly speaking, nothing good would come from involving ourselves with him and his family other than the most basic of pleasantries they are afforded as my kin. Now come, darling. I'm sure our children are in need of our supervision. Just before Heidi was about to speak of her lament toward his poor relationship with his brother, a voice interrupted them, confirming that their children were well looked after. It was a voice that they were both all too familiar with, as it belonged to Bruno's father, who shared the same name. He had a warm smile on his face as he spoke to his youngest son and the man's wife, who he believed was the daughter he never had. Oh, my grandchildren are fine without the intervention of their parents. Elsa is currently looking after them. You know how your mother is, Bruno. She will make sure those little tykes of yours behave themselves. But I fear Maximilian's departure has left me with multiple questions. Would you mind if I speak to you alone for a few moments? If that is okay with you, my dear. Obviously, Bruno's father was referring to his wife, Elsa, and not Bruno's youngest daughter, whose birthday it was today. As for Heidi, she quickly smiled and parted ways for the two men to speak, referring to her husband's father as if he were her own as she did so. Not at all, father. Bruno, I will be heading back to the kitchen if mother is taking care of the kids. If you need me, you know where to find me. Until we meet again, my love. After saying this, Heidi scurried off to do as she had voiced, while Bruno's father grabbed hold of his shoulder and patted it thrice before expressing his exhaust with a heavy sigh and a voice filled with regret. What did that wastrel of a son of mine do now that would compel him to go scurrying off like a pitiful roach that has been exposed to the light without saying a word to his parents? Bruno chuckled slightly as he thought about what he had said to Maximilian. He had promised not to turn the man into the authorities, but he had made no such vow in regards to their father. Because of this, he was more than willing to speak of what had been said behind closed doors, implying to his father as he did so that it was a long story and that he should prepare himself for it. How much time do you have, father? The aging patriarch of the von Zehntner family narrowed his eyes, quickly reading between the lines, so to speak, as he ensured Bruno he had more than enough time on his hands to hear the full tale without actually saying it. I suppose we should find some place quiet to discuss this, shall we? Preferably away from potential prying eyes and unwanted ears. Bruno nodded his head before leading his father to his private office, where he had just spoken to Maximilian. He revealed the full extent of the conversation that was held in this very room not long before, but this time over drinks with his father. When Bruno's father came to learn of Maximilian's unscrupulous plots and schemes, he was quickly enraged, making a promise to have his son learn a valuable lesson about such roguish behavior. That little shit. I help him get a position where he doesn't have to do much work for a good paycheck. And this is how he repays me? By trying to steal the merit and worth of a greater man than himself and sully our family's reputation in the process? It's good that you told me about this, Bruno. I will make sure that brat of an older brother of yours is never in a position to do as he has confessed to you. Do you have a phone here in your office? I need to make a quick call, and I am afraid it can't wait. Bruno quickly motioned towards his office's personal phone before assuring his father he was more than free to use it. By all means, I'll pour us another few drinks while you make your call. After doing this, Bruno's father had a lengthy conversation with various individuals in the government, ensuring that Maximilian was not only fired from his useless bureaucratic job at the patent office, but also thoroughly investigated for potential theft of intellectual property. Luckily for the man and his family, he had not acted upon his ill intents thus far, and was thus only dealt a pink slip for his villainous schemes. And though Bruno didn't realize it yet, his father would go the extra mile. He would do this by cutting Maximilian off from any financial support that the family may have been providing him until he could redeem himself, and even mentioned how if the scoundrel dared to shame the family with any further criminal acts or conspiracies, he would be thoroughly disowned and would be forced to change his surname altogether. When Bruno came to learn of Maximilian's downfall that had been wrought by his own hand, Bruno couldn't help but wonder whether or not karma was actually a cosmic force that affected all life in the universe, or if this was some divine ploy by God to punish the wicked with subtle actions that one could never be entirely sure he was responsible or not. What was the saying again? When you do things right, people won't be sure you have done anything at all. Perhaps that was a philosophy Bruno should take to heart. Or maybe he would continue doing things the way he had already done so thus far in this new lease on life. Chapter 168. Returning to the Land of the Rising Sun. After dealing with his rather useless twat of an elder brother and celebrating his daughter's birthday appropriately, Bruno would finally open the letter sent to him by Emperor Meiji. It was, as he suspected, a letter of invitation to visit the land of the rising sun to witness the prototype machine gun they had developed as per the recommendations he had made in passing. Even if the machine gun turned out to be relatively crude, the mere idea that it would be using an air-cooled quick-change barrel, along with a built-in bipod, stock, and pistol group, meant it was leagues ahead of what was currently being fielded by all nations other than the Reich. Because of this, Bruno was quite interested, as if his recommendations were followed to the letter. Then it was entirely possible that a new machine gun had been developed, one that only existed because of his interference in the timeline. With this in mind, he said a brief farewell to his wife and children, assuring them that he would be back in a few months. He then took the first available railcar to Hamburg, where he set off on a ship to the Eastern world. Technically speaking, with the fastest ships of the era, traveling from Germany to Japan was itself a month-and-a-half-long journey. Aircraft were currently in their infancy, and there were still many decades to go before commercial aircraft were invented, let alone used as the primary means of passenger travel internationally. Because of this, one either had to travel by train or by ship across the world's treacherous seas. With this in mind, Bruno had opted for the latter, as it was more expedient to do so rather than take a train across all of Europe and Russia until arriving in their far eastern territories, where he would then have to cross the sea into Japan proper. The journey itself was a rather dull affair, with nothing of note occurring during the month-and-a-half time it took for him to arrive on the Japanese mainland. Since this was technically a diplomatic meeting, he merely treated the journey aboard the luxurious ocean liner as a luxury cruise, relaxing as well as he could until he finally arrived at his destination. Upon stepping foot in the capital of Japan, Bruno was once more welcomed by state officials, who quickly escorted him to the emperor's palace. It had more or less been 5 years since he last visited this place, and things had not changed in the slightest. Well, perhaps there were a few minor changes, as the uniforms worn by the Japanese military personnel around the imperial palace were of a more khaki or tan color rather than the old blue and red uniforms they wore during his last visit. After all, this was a time when many nations were transitioning to more earthy tones in their uniforms, along with more modern weaponry, and that had largely been a result of Bruno's interference in the timeline. Sure, such a change would naturally be occurring about this time, but these new uniforms had been adopted much earlier than they otherwise should have. Considering there was a medal pinned to Bruno's chest that belonged to the Order of the Rising Sun, any Japanese soldier who saw Bruno was quick to salute the man, despite his foreign appearance and uniform. This was a sign of respect, which he returned to these servicemen before ultimately being led into a chamber within the palace where Emperor Meiji waited for him. Though his armed forces had transitioned to khaki uniforms, he still wore the blue, red, and gold uniforms of the preceding era. It was not hard to understand why. Sure, they were more practical in the field, but they were also far more majestic in overall design. Hence why, to this day, many monarchs still chose to wear the older and more stylish uniforms. Either way, Bruno stared firmly in front of the Japanese emperor while all of his subjects bowed before him. Afterward, he quickly greeted Bruno, mentioning how the man had barely aged since the last time he saw him. I would have thought with all the stress you have been under these past few years, you would have doubled your age, and yet here you stand, not a day older than the last time we met. Care to tell me your secret? Bruno chuckled in response to this praise, quickly returning it with a joke that the legendary Japanese emperor found humorous. You praise me too much. Everyone knows that it is the people of the Orient who age better than anyone else in this world. I merely am slightly better than the rest of my kind. Now, tell me, Your Majesty, why did you invite me across the world to your home? Your letter was very vague about the details of my visit. This was more or less true, as one was required to read through the lines and have a proper understanding of what Bruno had said to Emperor Meiji during his past visit to fully understand what the words written in the letter truly described. Upon seeing that Bruno was not one to stand on ceremony, Emperor Meiji smirked before leading the way to the testing facility. There, Bruno gazed upon a machine gun that most certainly caught his interest. As previously described, it was a brand new machine gun, one that he had never read about or seen pictures of in his past life. It was vaguely similar to the BSA GPMG prototype from his past life, but with many design choices carried over from the Type 96, such as the fully finned barrel, the conical flash suppressor, and the distinctive carrying handle, stock, and pistol grip. Where its similarities to the BSA GPMG lay was in regards to its feeding mechanism and the belt holder. Bruno was honestly rather impressed as he gazed upon the distinctive prototype, quickly asking a question of the Emperor as he examined its features. "May I?" The Emperor of Japan quickly assured Bruno that he could handle the firearm, as Bruno was the one who had made the suggestions that resulted in such a machine gun design. The Empire of Japan was rather hit or miss when it came to firearms development during his past life. During the Second World War and the years leading up to it, they had either made exceptional pieces of engineering, like the Type 96 light machine gun, which this was based upon, or had made absolute pieces of garbage that were either unreliable or, frankly speaking, a bigger detriment to the operator than the enemy they were aiming at, such as the scarcely produced Type 100 submachine gun, the Type 14 Nambu pistol, and the Type 95 Nambu pistol. Considering this weapon was merely a prototype and would need to go under substantial testing and improvement, Bruno was already impressed that the Japanese engineers had created something that was not only semi-functional, but also had great potential. Because of this, he slowly began dismantling the weapon, as if he already knew how it functioned, merely by spending less than a minute observing it. After field stripping and examining each and every component carefully, Bruno had a few recommendations on how to improve it. "You see this? This component has already begun to warp and shape. You need to increase the hardness of the steel and make it consistent across the board. But other than that, you are on the right path. So keep up the good work." Emperor Meiji nodded his head in satisfaction. He had neglected to notice such a minute detail, but the fact that Bruno had even bothered to point it out would save the Japanese arsenal many hours of experimentation and problem-solving. Because of this, the Japanese emperor was quick to thank Bruno for his insight and his approval before dragging him back to the palace. "I'm sorry for making such an invitation solely for this purpose, but I wanted to see whether or not your words of wisdom had borne proper fruit or merely a spoiled product. Please enjoy yourself within my home for the next week or two. I'll make sure you are given a proper tour of the city as an honored guest from the German Reich. How does that sound?" Bruno nodded his head with a polite smile on his face, thanking the Japanese emperor for his hospitality as he did so. "Your generosity is truly exemplary of your character, Your Majesty. I will gladly take you up on your offer. And while I am staying here, perhaps I can give you a few other words of wisdom, as you put it. Our nations are allies, after all, and I get the feeling that soon we may need to honor that allegiance. Which means, as far as I am concerned, the better armed my allies are, the worse off my enemies would be when that day finally arrives. Won't you agree?" Emperor Meiji smirked upon hearing Bruno's words, nodding his head as he led the man into his home once more, assuring him that they would be the best of allies when the Great War finally broke out. Oh, you can count on that. Chapter 169, An Unfortunate Chain of Misunderstandings. It did not take long for Bruno to find himself greeted by some familiar faces he had not seen in more than a couple of years. By his count, it was close to 5 years since he had seen these people. In such a large and magnificent palace, it was not uncommon for the entire extended royal family to dwell within it, or at least gather very often. Japan was no exception, with the emperor's sons, daughters, and grandchildren all living within his personal abode. At the same time, whatever siblings and children he had were also present, probably as a show that he valued Bruno as a representative of his most powerful ally. Bruno spoke with various members of the emperor's family, all of whom were as pleasant to him as they had been when he was awarded the Order of the Rising Sun all those years ago for his actions at Port Arthur. More or less, He remembered the faces he saw, especially the adults, as they had not changed all that much in a mere 4 to 5 years. However, there was one person he did not recognize as he greeted the Japanese royal family for the second time in his life. Frankly speaking, the transformation was far too much for Bruno, who had not seen her since she was a little girl, to fully comprehend. This was a girl who did not exist in his past life. After all, her father was one of Emperor Meiji's sons, who had died in Bruno's previous life during childhood. It was because of this and other small changes that were different from the history he knew from his past life that Bruno was aware that while this world was nearly identical to the one he had once lived in, it was not a perfect 1:1 scale replica. After all, this teenage girl was most certainly proof of this. Bruno had not recognized who this girl was, as his memory of her was brief, and she was roughly 10 years old at the time they first met. Instead, he bowed respectfully before her and introduced himself as if they were unacquainted prior to this moment. "My apologies, Princess. We must have missed each other during my last visit. My name is Lord Bruno von Zehntner, Generaloberst of the German army. It would be my highest honor if I could learn your identity." Bruno was stunned when the teenage girl looked at him with fury in her eyes before shifting her head and line of sight away from him entirely. She quickly began to pout and cross her arms as she responded to him with Bruno's alternative identity. "Well, Prince Zehntner, it appears you didn't get a good enough impression of me when we last met. And here I was, dying to meet with you again after all these years, yet you clearly didn't once think of me." After saying this, the girl stormed off, throwing a minor hissy fit as she did so, causing Bruno to become confused. It finally hit him who the teenage girl was. He looked over to Emperor Meiji, who was smirking at him with a shit-eating grin, and voiced his confusion aloud. "Don't tell me that girl is Princess Sakura?" Emperor Meiji nodded his head. His niece had followed Bruno's rapid and legendary rise to prominence quite thoroughly over the years. She was what one might consider his greatest fangirl, and her admiration for him grew with each major achievement he received. Because of this, she was quite offended that he appeared to have forgotten all about her existence, which could only cause her uncle, her father, and all of her older relatives to laugh at her anger, as they knew all too well Bruno would not have recognized her. She had grown quite beautiful and was no longer a small child. They also knew Bruno was a man who was already happily married and had no thoughts toward other women, as rumors of other monarchs trying to tempt him with their daughters, especially after he had become a bona fide prince himself, had spread even to the land of the rising sun. Not to mention, Bruno was a foreigner, and it would appear that Westerners had a hard time differentiating the people of the Orient from one another. As a result, they suspected he would probably not even remember their brief encounter all those years ago, let alone recognize her face. Bruno, who prided himself on always remembering a face, felt stumped as Emperor Meiji laughed at his expense, while also making an unfair remark that only added further fuel to the fire. "Oh, isn't this a surprise? My little niece has been quite the adoring fan of yours, following your exploits since your performance in Port Arthur. To think the hero she adored had so thoroughly forgotten her, I truly pity the girl. Still, it surprises me that you even remembered her name, albeit I'm afraid it was a bit too late to bring the girl any happiness she initially expected to achieve from this second encounter with her idol." Bruno couldn't help but stare at Meiji as if he were a bastard for mocking him to such an extent. I mean, honestly, the last time he saw her, she was a literal child. And sure, she was still young, but she was old enough to have developed quite significantly during this time. Did he really expect him to instantly recognize her, especially since they only had one conversation together nearly half a decade prior? As for the admiration that Meiji claimed she had for him, that was simply unfathomable for Bruno. He was just a soldier at the end of the day, doing the job required of him. He wasn't some legendary hero of a Greek epic, and he did not deserve to be revered as such. Because of this, Bruno sighed and shook his head, expressing his thoughts aloud, a sentiment that caused more than a few members of the Japanese royal family to raise their brows in curiosity. "I'm nobody's hero." After saying this, Bruno returned to greeting the rest of the imperial Japanese family members, none of whom had left as thorough an impression on him as the emperor, his sons, and the young teenage princess, who apparently had developed some form of fascination with his career. Princess Sakura was more than displeased by the fact that Bruno had appeared to have forgotten about her. She stormed off to her room to sulk in silence for a while, missing the banquet that was thrown in Bruno's honor, as she instead wrote to her pen pals about her dissatisfaction. The letters previously exchanged between her and these strangers were hewn across the desk, openly on display for anyone who dared to enter her room. Had Bruno followed the girl to apologize, he would have noticed that the Japanese princess was in communication with a few other girls roughly her age, with whom he had come into contact over the years. Grand Duchess Olga Nikolaevna of Russia, Archduchess Hedwig of Austro-Hungary, and Princess Victoria Louise of Prussia. Had Bruno discovered this, he would immediately understand why the Prussian princess had insulted him by calling him a rake during his last encounter with her. As these various princesses had, through a chain of letters, discovered that Bruno had come into contact with them all, and though Bruno had never expressed any interest in any of them as romantic partners, merely using them as a tool to establish friendlier ties with various noble houses, they, in their youthful naivety, had mistaken his kind fa ade as some form of courtship. After realizing that he was merely being friendly with the lot of them for diplomatic purposes, they again mistook this fact as if he were some kind of degenerate womanizer. Sakura had not truly believed Bruno was of such a character until now, where she wrote to her friends about how the man was truly an outlandish rake of the highest order. She further slandered his good name out of some form of misplaced resentment toward the other princesses with whom Bruno had come into contact. Though Bruno did not realize it yet, he would have to bear the consequences of this misunderstanding at a later date. But for now, he was enjoying himself and the hospitality of the legendary Japanese emperor, who desired to pick the man's brain, specifically regarding his vision of a great war and when it would come. This was a war that the Japanese royal family seemed plausible, but also, at the same time, somehow disconnected from their reality. Any war the Japanese fought with the great powers of the world would be fought in Asia, where their military strength was lacking. Either way, Meiji was convinced this was an opportunity that Japan could take advantage of to seize territory, defeat the British and French empires, and in doing so establish themselves as an equal to the West. Chapter 170. Diplomacy and Business. Bruno had more or less entertained the Japanese aristocracy for the night, or at the very least, the royal family of the Eastern Empire. Sakura, of course, was very angry with Bruno for not immediately recognizing her, and had stormed off to her room to write a series of angry letters, venting her frustrations to her pen pals, who just so happened to be the other princesses with whom Bruno was acquainted. It wasn't all too surprising that these young women all knew each other. After all, the German Reich, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russian Empire, and the Empire of Japan were in a military alliance with one another at the moment. To say that there was at least one opportunity over the past few years for them all to meet up together and hit it off was an understatement. Diplomacy was an important part of a monarch's duties, and oftentimes it was conducted in person, over dinner, with one's family. What was diplomacy if not business conducted over the scale of international boundaries? And because of this, Princess Sakura was well acquainted with the other princesses. Bruno had more or less established some degree of familiarity with over the years of conducting operations overseas. By morning the next day, however, Bruno found himself in an awkward setting. He was eating dinner with Emperor Meiji's family, and Sakura was giving him the stink eye, much to the amusement of her father, mother, uncles, and grandfather, all of whom felt a bit of joy at Bruno's misfortune. Because of this, Bruno eventually sighed, coming up with some line that would only further the misunderstandings that existed between him and the adolescent princess, albeit in the opposite direction. "I must humbly apologize, Your Highness. I did not realize who you were immediately, and though I am entirely at fault, I must admit the last time I saw you, you were but a young girl, but now you have blossomed into quite the beautiful woman. I'm sure whoever you marry in the future will be a very lucky man." Bruno's words were more or less honest, if not exaggerated in terms of flattery. After all, nobles love to have their asses kissed especially. It was one of the reasons Bruno seldom liked finding company with his own class in society. Nevertheless, it seemed to have worked, as the girl blushed and muttered something beneath her breath that Bruno did not hear. "You really think I'm that pretty?" Bruno quickly asked what Sakura had said, as he did not hear anything other than a mutter, causing the girl to panic and pretend like she hadn't said anything. And since she wasn't willing to reveal it, he left the matter be. Meanwhile, the teenage princess's mother simply smirked and did not say a word. Either way, both of their expressions and actions made Bruno feel a bit uncomfortable, so he decided to stir up another topic for discussion, one that would change the overall environment in the room to something more stern. So, Your Majesty, Emperor Meiji, how long do you think it will be before you have fully tested and developed these new machine guns of yours so that they are capable of mass production? The emperor was more than happy to discuss this matter, as any further insights he could glean from Bruno would be ideal. Thus, he was more than willing to let the previous discussion die, as he addressed Bruno with a rather excited expression on his aging face. My engineers have assured me that the weapon should be fully developed and ready for field trials within another 3 years at the most. Assuming it passes those field trials, then it will be ready for mass production by 1912 at the latest. This was a good estimate as far as Bruno was concerned, and because of this, Bruno nodded his head in satisfaction with Emperor Meiji's words. If proven to be true, they would give the Imperial Japanese Army a significant increase in terms of firepower to be wielded against the British and French colonies in the Eastern world. If they caused enough casualties, it could even go so far as to force the Allied powers to divert forces from the Western Front of Asia, especially if the British Raj came under attack. However, this estimate put many things in perspective. To many in the room, 3 to 4 years almost seemed like a lifetime away, whereas Bruno felt it was even longer. With each passing day, he would wait for the countdown to get closer and closer to the outbreak of the Great War, which was supposed to begin in 1914. It was both a dreaded future and an anticipated one for the man. Even so, he had no way of knowing if the war would break out sooner in this life, as the changes he had made to the timeline via his direct or indirect interference in major global events that in his past life had contributed to the conflict could potentially have significant consequences on the overall timeline in this war. Frankly speaking, Bruno desired for the war to break out in 1914 at the earliest. It gave him the time needed to ensure that his weapons were properly tested and fielded at least in some capacity. The more advanced weapons that the German Reich was currently in the process of creating were either not yet fielded in significant enough numbers to change the outcome of the war, or were simply not even completed at this point in time. If the war broke out tomorrow, for example, Bruno would have to revert back to the Schlieffen Plan and pray the advantage and firepower gained from having a few regiments armed with the latest weaponry would be enough to break the Anglo-French defenses at the Marne. A battle that the Germans had lost in his past life was the event responsible for the creation of static trench warfare, which plagued the Western Front until the end of the war. If the war broke out in 1914, the German army would have the overwhelming advantage in firepower, but the result of another quick victory like the one had in 1871 would simply embolden his enemies to wage another war in 20 years' time. Bruno's defensive strategy was designed to inflict the most pain and suffering possible on the British and French armies so that their people would never again question the German Reich's hegemony over Europe, and hopefully deter them from waging another pointless war that would only wreak more havoc and destruction on the world. That was his hope, but whether or not any of these plans would come to fruition was dependent entirely on the butterfly effect and how his actions in this life, both significant and insignificant, shaped the world around him. Ultimately, it was Princess Sakura who broke the long silence, as she begged her royal grandfather for a favor, shifting everyone's focus to her. "Beloved grandfather, may I please be excused from this meal? I just realized that I have a few letters, which I need to, change the contents of, and if I don't go fetch them quickly, it will be too late." Sakura had been won over from her poor attitude rather quickly. All it took was a charming smile and exaggerated flattery, and the girl was back in Bruno's good graces. Bruno, of course, did not know the letters she wanted to dispose of were the ones she had written about him, addressed to the other princesses. Letters which contained all forms of slanderous and scandalous statements. Now that she had reverted back to being his admirer, she did not want these letters to be sent, and because of this, she had requested to leave the dinner early. An unusual request, but Meiji was wise enough to suspect something was amiss, and he silently nodded his head, causing the adolescent princess to scurry off like a frightened rabbit as she ran out of the dining hall, her jet-black twin tails flailing behind her as she did so. Unfortunately for the Japanese princess and Bruno alike, by the time she managed to get to her room, the letters on her desk, which had been sealed with her signet ring, stamped, and addressed to her pen pals, were gone. The maids had collected them and sent them off to the postal service on her behalf, meaning that in a few weeks, or perhaps even months' time, the princesses of the German Reich, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Russian Empire would believe that Bruno was a man most heinous, one who they would be disgusted by whenever they caught his glimpse, and whose name they would tarnish every time they spoke of it. That is, of course, at least until Bruno could find a way to properly correct the tangled web of misunderstandings between him and the three royal daughters of the world's most powerful emperors, a task that would require careful diplomacy, patience, and perhaps more than a little charm. But that was a story for another time. Chapter 171, The Second-Born Son. Bruno's time in Japan, or at least during his second visit to the Eastern Island nation, was one of relative peace. Other than the drama that occurred on the first 2 days of his visit, Bruno was given a full tour of the industrial nation and was able to witness its ongoing developments in an era that was renowned in history for, in many ways, being the last days of an older world. But eventually, the time came to return to the Reich once more, a return that Bruno greatly anticipated. If the man was being honest with himself, diplomatic efforts were not exactly something he was fond of performing on behalf of his nation and Kaiser. But Bruno was first and foremost a soldier, and a soldier did his duty regardless of his own personal feelings towards whatever that duty may entail. Upon returning to the fatherland, after months of travel at sea, Bruno found himself welcomed at the rail station by his wife and his children. Of course, Bruno's older children were more than happy to see their father, who had been gone for more or less 4 months, return home at last. They knew he was on a peaceful venture overseas, but being away from their father for so long naturally instilled a sense of dread in them. After all, many things could happen on a months-long voyage across the world's oceans, and some of those possibilities were a frightening reality. The girls were easily the happiest. With their father's return, their mother's tyranny had come to a swift and sudden end. Even in such a large palace, the woman had a damn near instinctive ability to tell when her children were misbehaving and was not far behind to catch them in the act, and, in doing so, discipline them thoroughly. With Bruno's leniency to his girls, it was as if the figurative chains about their necks had been released, as they jumped into their hero's arms and hugged him tightly. "Daddy is home." Such a warm gesture and a loving statement were more than enough to make Bruno feel welcomed upon stepping off the train, which took him from Hamburg to Berlin, and witnessing his loved ones waiting for his return. Bruno, of course, greeted his 2 young girls with the same familial love, as he kissed them both on the forehead while holding them in his embrace, ensuring the 2 girls he would not leave them to their mother's authoritarian nature for at least some time. "Daddy is home indeed, and he loves you 2 girls very much. Besides, I won't be going anywhere again for a very long time." Heidi, of course, had a stern expression on her face when she realized her husband was spoiling their daughters again, but she could never truly stay mad at the man and thus sighed and rolled her eyes, all while holding their newborn son in her arms. That's right, during his absence, Heidi had given birth to a healthy baby son. She was, after all, already several months pregnant when he left. Because of this, Bruno apologized profusely to his beloved wife for missing the birth of their newest child. Heidi was a forgiving woman, at least when it came to her loved ones, and easily let this matter go. Of course, there were conditions. Bruno would have to spend the next few days with his family and nobody else. Work be damned. He needed a break after being forced to fulfill the Kaiser's personal obligations as a monarch. He was a general, not a diplomat, and if it weren't for the fact that Emperor Meiji was personally fond of him, he wouldn't have had to travel across the entire world for the sake of entertaining foreign nobles. Bruno hugged his wife and kissed her on the lips, while addressing their newborn son, who luckily he and his wife had agreed upon a name for prior to his departure. "And this must be little Joseph, isn't that right? Or did you name the boy something else behind my back?" Heidi immediately feigned offense at such a question, acting as if she were genuinely aggrieved by such an assertion, which she knew all too well was her husband's attempt at humor. And Bruno, of course, knew she was also pulling his leg with her rather impressive act. Am I such a woman in your eyes that I would actually go so far as to name our child something different than we, his parents, agreed upon just because I had the opportunity to do so because of your absence at the time of his birth? If you have such a low opinion of me, then I have no idea why we are even married. By now, Eva, Erwin, and Elsa were all too familiar with the way their parents acted and rolled their eyes at their little playful dispute, knowing that in the next second they would be hugging and kissing just as they had done seconds prior to such a well-performed fade. And this is exactly what happened as the two broke out into laughter before embracing in a public place. Shame be damned. Bruno had been away from his wife and children for so long, and he did not give a shit if onlookers judged them for daring to display their affection in public. Heidi was equally shameless, as her mindset was the same, and thus, in a rather scandalous act, they shared a very intimate kiss before breaking off, where Heidi then asserted their dinner that evening would be absolute perfection. Welcome home, my love. I assure you that when dinner is prepared this evening, it will be flawlessly to your liking. This was exactly what Bruno wanted to hear. There was nothing better in this world than a meal cooked for you by a woman who loved you, whether that be your mother or your wife. And while the food he had consumed the last few months had been nothing but exquisite, it failed to stir the emotions in his heart the way his wife's home cooking did. Even if the food was partially prepared by a professional staff, it was ultimately overseen and cooked by his wife at the end of the day, and Bruno most certainly appreciated that. Hence why he took his young son into his arms and introduced himself with a gleeful smile on his face. Hello, Joseph, I'm your father. I'm sorry we haven't been able to meet until now, and I know it will be one of the greatest regrets I have in this life. But I assure you I will spend the rest of my life making up for this. Naturally, the child did not understand a word Bruno had said, being at most 2 months old, if even that. But nevertheless, Bruno felt the need to properly introduce himself to his newborn son, if not simply for his sake. His wife and children watched Bruno speak to his young son. They were all as happy as he was. Well, except for perhaps Erwin, who was having problems with the fact that a new son had been born. This meant he was no longer his father's sole potential heir. It also meant that Bruno would have a little brother to compete with in life, which was ultimately something Erwin did not know if he truly desired. Whatever the reason, Bruno handed Joseph back to his mother, noticing the conflicted glint in his eldest son's eyes, and simply patted his head, assuring him that just because he had a little brother, he would not be treated any differently. And what are you looking at, little man? You think just because you have a little brother that I will favor him over you? If anything, his life will be more difficult than yours is, as he will always be seeking to prove himself against that which you have already proven yourself to be, and will continue to prove yourself to be. Besides, your mother and I are still young. I'm sure you will have plenty more siblings to speak of in the coming years. So don't you dare treat that little boy any different than you would your sisters. You understand me. Having raised his son properly, the boy immediately lost whatever conflict he felt in his heart, and instead nodded at his father with a look of understanding, responding to the man with the utmost respect as he did so. Yes, sir. Seeing that he had properly dismissed any behavioral problems his oldest son might have now that he had a younger brother to compete with, Bruno patted the boy on the back before walking with his family towards where their car was waiting for them. One of many that was currently being protected by armed security. After all, a convoy was best to ensure the safety of him and his family, which is exactly how they drove back to their home. Now let's go spend some quality time together as a proper family. Chapter 172. A new era of naval warfare. Life passed by pretty quickly while Bruno continued about his daily life within the German Reich. All he could do during this time was make the necessary preparations for the upcoming war, one which would engulf the entire world, or at least the vast majority of it, and would cause the deaths of tens of millions of people, primarily the poor souls sent to the trenches. By 1911, the German army had completely overhauled its armament and doctrine. Every single rifleman was now equipped and trained with the Gür-05 semi-automatic service rifle, which had become the standard issue weapon for the German army and its soldiers. The Gür-05, of course, being the designation given to the modified variant of the Gür-43, which Bruno had designed in this life. Aside from the GUR-05, there was also at least one man in each squad armed with an MG-05, MG-34 general-purpose machine gun. In addition to this, the NCO in charge of the squad wielded an MP-05, MP-34 submachine gun, making the doctrine incredibly similar to the ones used by the German infantry units in the Second World War. Artillery was attached to each infantry regiment, utilizing a mixture of the four gun types Bruno had designed early on in this life. And at the platoon level, there were small units of men armed and trained to use 60 mm, 80 mm, and 120 mm mortars. To say that the German army was the most well-equipped army in the world was an understatement, and currently its size was bigger than it was in Bruno's life at the start of the war, with 1 million men actively serving and another 4 million reserves to be called upon and mobilized at a moment's notice. This was in contrast to Bruno's past life, where they had 700,000 men actively serving and 3.8 million who could be mobilized within a single week. Either way, the German army was well prepared for the war. In addition to these efforts, the German Luftstreicher, FTE had 5 full wings of operational He-51 interwar era biplanes that were capable of performing the roles of reconnaissance, attack fighter, and close air support/bomber. The border preparations had more or less been completed and were a stark line of defense and deterrence against any potential Anglo-French invasion. When the war broke out, British and French troops would break against the wall. While the bulk of Germany's armed forces, alongside their allies in Russia and Austria-Hungary, would push into Serbia, Italy, as well as potentially Romania and the Ottoman Empire, seeking to capitulate their rivals in a swift and decisive victory before turning their attention to the Western Front. This was the plan, but few plans ever really went as one hoped they would, especially when facing the multitude of unknown quantities that revealed themselves on a modern battlefield. All that really remained of Bruno's preparations were the launching of his advanced submarines and destroyers. And today, a major step forward in this regard had been made, with Bruno being called out to Danzig to discuss this matter with his naval engineers. Today, Bruno stood before the men who were responsible for designing a very important device. Standing in front of him was a fully production-ready variation of 2 onboard ship computational devices. The first was meant for the destroyers and other surface ships. It was large, bulky, and resilient beyond one's imagination. The second was much more compact and was instead designed for use onboard submarines. These were really the major devices Bruno had been waiting on before mass-producing his destroyers and submarines. When he activated the so-called range keeper, which itself performed complex calculations at a fraction of the speed of what the average human commander was capable of, he smirked something fiercely before patting his lead naval engineer on the back. After doing so, Bruno broke out into laughter before saying the words that would be quoted throughout the annals of human history. "Gentlemen, it is no exaggeration to say that today you have single-handedly won the war on the seas for the German Reich." Bruno's compliments were, of course, grand, but these men knew all too well what these machines meant. They meant a significant increase in hit probability. During the Battle of Jutland, it was said that out of all the shots fired by the infamous dreadnought battleships, perhaps 3% of them at the most hit their targets. With these devices, the hit probability had skyrocketed, meaning that Germany held the single greatest advantage on the seas if every warship was equipped with these computational devices. Even pre-dreadnought class battleships would have the ability to sink their formidable and more advanced dreadnought opponents. Though obsolete, most navies still fielded many of these ships, and while the dreadnought was far more formidable, if it could only land 3% of its shots, then it didn't really matter how big its guns were when the enemy was able to have a higher hit probability of more than 10 times their percentage. Was a pre-dreadnought class battleship capable of sinking a dreadnought with a single shot? Probably not, not unless they were particularly lucky. But were they able to sink a dreadnought with 10 shots? Oh, most certainly. And if they could land those 10 shots before the enemy could hit them back, wasn't that just superb? Bruno was extremely happy that these devices had finally been finished, albeit a little bit later than initially projected. Either way, his funding had not gone to waste, and the engineers were glad that he was not angry about missing the deadline they had given him of 1910. Instead, Bruno congratulated them all on their efforts. You have all done incredible work today, and I have no doubt that the Kaiserlich Marine will emerge victorious on the seven seas in the wars to come because of what you have all done here over these last few years. Forgive me for not properly celebrating with you all, but reporting the completion of this project to the Grand Admirals is of the utmost importance. I will personally recommend all of you for some form of commendation suiting what you have all done here today. Though I fear it may not be until the war is won that your contributions are fully understood by those in power, so I beg of you all to be patient with me in this matter. After saying this, Bruno said a few last words to his engineers, promising them all a grand bonus for the year, before running off to inform the Admiralty of what had been accomplished. With the computational devices completed and the next generation class of destroyers and submarines soon to begin mass production, Germany was on its path to securing the waves for the Reich. But there was still one last device Bruno wanted to design and put into production, something that was far simpler to make than the majority of what he had spent the last decade designing, testing, and producing, but was far more important than them all. Still, that was a matter for another time. Instead, he spoke with his contact in the German Navy, Admiral Henning von Holzendorf, first calling the man up and informing him that a project which he was interested in had been completed. It was best not to say too much over the phone, and because of that, Bruno was invited to the headquarters of the German Navy, where he stood before a board of admirals and explained what had been created by his own engineers and his minor contributions to the project. When they heard in great detail what Bruno had spoken of, and how he had spent the last 10 years investing in the manufacture of warships capable of protecting trade and hunting the enemy while remaining entirely submerged beneath the surface of the ocean's waves, they were blown away by the man's foresight into naval matters. Only Henning really knew how capable Bruno was when it came to not only matters of army organization, strategy, tactics, and logistics, but also that of the naval persuasion as well. With this meeting having taken several hours to properly explain, the conclusion among the Admiralty was that the computational devices, as well as the advanced warships that were to be introduced in the coming years, would be a classified matter of the utmost secrecy. Any ship that was damaged at sea or at risk of capture by the enemy was to be scuttled, and the computational devices on board were to be destroyed immediately. They could not risk the enemy getting their hands on any of the advanced technology that Bruno had brought to the world decades before they were supposed to exist. Bruno was most satisfied with this conclusion, and while everything he had spent his entire military career working towards was starting to become realized in physical form, there was still one last major innovation he had to make in preparation for the Great War. Because of this, the moment he got home and sat down at his desk, he began designing the infamous Enigma machine. Chapter 173, Enigma. Things were progressing much as Bruno had predicted on the global stage. The year was currently 1911, and soon enough the advanced type XXI U-boats Bruno had prepared years in advance would begin production, hopefully replacing the current U-boat types, which were woefully obsolete when compared to the variant he had introduced to the world decades in advance. And while his armored vehicles, planes, and warships were all either already in production or were getting close to it, there was one other invention Bruno had not introduced until now. It was, frankly speaking, an oversight on his part not to do so earlier, but at the same time, he still had enough time left before the war began that it didn't matter all that much. Currently, Bruno was at home, with a beer stein in one hand and a sandwich in the other, looking over the details of the rough draft he had just concluded. It was a rather small device, at least compared to the weapons he had already designed. But it was perhaps the most critical piece of technology to ensure the success of the German Reich in the Great War that was to come. Granted, Bruno did not know all the ins and outs of the initial design, nor was he fully versed in the study of cryptography, but he had plenty of men in his employ who could make his vision a reality. The mechanical engineering aspects of the legendary cipher known as the Enigma machine were well within his field of expertise to at least get a proof of concept going. The Enigma machine was, as previously stated, a cipher, and quite the advanced one at that. It was said in more common circles to have been damn near uncrackable and would have never been solved if not for several blunders of the Third Reich, some of which were entirely political and bureaucratic in nature. While the Polish, with the aid of the French intelligence services, managed to create a device capable of cracking the Enigma code as early as 1933, Updates to the platform, such as adding a fourth rotor, made such efforts obsolete. It was not until 1942, when a British mathematician and logician named Alan Turing managed to overcome these problems, and only after the Allies had managed to capture German cipher keys. Frankly speaking, however, such knowledge was well beyond the Entente's capabilities during the Great War, and Bruno expected a proper Enigma machine developed in accordance with the standards of its last generation from his previous life would be more than enough to make it impossible to intercept and decode German communications. The Enigma machine itself was a rather simple instrument, making use of a combination of mechanical and electrical subsystems. The mechanical subsystem consisted of a keyboard and a set of rotating discs that were arranged adjacently along a spindle. The spindle was one of various components to turn at least one rotor with each key press. Finally, there was a series of lamps, one for each letter. These lamps would light up for the corresponding letter of the alphabet in accordance with the encrypted code on the rotor. Aside from that, it was relatively lightweight and completely portable. While Bruno had just finished his lunch for the day, his wife Heidi knocked on the door. The rules were simple in Bruno's office. Nobody was allowed to enter without first obtaining permission to do so. Even Heidi had to abide by these rules, not that she found fault with them. She had previously knocked on her husband's door to make sure he was ready for lunch and had done so just now. After giving the man enough time to complete the meal, in order to collect his plate and glass, which she was quick to announce after knocking thrice. "Dear, are you finished with your meal, or do you need another 5 minutes?" Having just wiped his mouth from the liquid that remained after completing his beer, Bruno was quick to announce that he was indeed ready for his plate and mug to be taken away. "Perfect timing, I just finished." Seeing this as having been granted permission to enter her husband's office, Heidi quickly smiled as she opened the door, walking over to Bruno's desk as she collected the empty plate and beer stein. She did not say a word as she was tidying up, that is until she noticed the device sitting on Bruno's desk. Having family members in German intelligence, Heidi was all too aware of what a cipher was. Although the one Bruno had rather crudely drawn was fairly advanced, so much so that she was quick to comment on its design. "Well, I was not expecting you to be working on such a thing. This is a cipher, isn't it? I have to say it's a rather ingenious design. Where did you come up with such a thing?" Bruno had yet to learn that his wife was more or less involved with the intelligence side of things within the German Reich. She had family members who were deeply entrenched in a variety of intelligence branches, and she had regular communication with them. A lot of people owed her favors, and she commonly collected on them to look out for her family's safety and prosperity, all without Bruno knowing. Because of this, Bruno was rather surprised that she knew what he had designed and how it would theoretically function. He quickly commented on this oddity that his wife had just expressed in front of him. "Since when are you a master of all things mechanical? Heidi, do you honestly know what this is?" Heidi left Bruno even further stunned when she wore a conceited smirk before walking out the door, not bothering to fully reveal the extent of her knowledge on the subject. Instead, she caused her husband to have even more questions as she shut the door behind herself. "You're not the only one protecting this family, you know?" Bruno stared dumbfounded at the door that Heidi had long since closed behind herself after carrying away his empty plate and beer stein. He honestly could not tell if the woman was joking or not. However, she did appear to have some degree of knowledge about what he had designed. That much was certain. Perhaps the enigma of the day was not the machine he had crafted a functional proof of concept for, but rather it was his wife. Just how much did he not know about the woman he loved despite growing up together and being married all these years? This was truly a question worth investigating, and because of this, Bruno immediately shifted his focus away from making preparations for the war and instead into investigating his wife's background, searching for things he may have overlooked over the years. Heidi had wanted to tell Bruno about her ties to the other half of her family for years, but he never seemed to ask, and she could never find the words to tell him about it. But as she had said, Bruno had not been the only one protecting their family. Though a bastard, Heidi had connections to very powerful people, especially within the world of German intelligence. Not only did she use these connections to keep an eye on Bruno and ensure he was safe in whatever conflict he had thrown himself into, but also to counter those shadowy figures working behind the scenes to harm him and their family. Sure, Bruno had taken precautions to protect his family after angering the Black Hand. But he didn't have the proper ties to German intelligence, other than the Stasi, to thoroughly work against the actions of the Black Hand and their many attempts on his life and that of his family. Heidi had more or less been the one working behind the scenes, together with her family and friends in German intelligence, toward this effort. In fact, if Bruno knew the number of Black Hand leadership she had caused the deaths of, he would be shocked. The Black Hand had rapidly grown in size since their first attempt on Bruno's life, only to have 1/3 of its membership find themselves with mysterious deaths over the years. A simple whisper here and there, and the agents of the German Reich's Foreign Intelligence Agency could be moved to take their lives. Heidi, having family in very powerful positions within these intelligence agencies, needed to simply make use of these personal connections and give them a name that she wanted to disappear from history. And they would. While Bruno was investigating her background, she had settled down on the sofa with a glass of wine in her hand and a folder. A folder that contained the photograph of a man Bruno would be deeply familiar with. The photograph was of Dragutin Dimitrijevi, better known by the nickname of Apis. He was the leader of the Black Hand. After closing the folder and putting it aside, Heidi reached toward a nearby phone and dialed a number, having the operator connect her to one of her cousins, a man who was currently the deputy director of German foreign intelligence. "Hello, Friedrich. Yes, this is your cousin Heidi. How have you been? That's good to hear. You tell Maria and the kids that they are always in my heart and prayers. Anyways, Friedrich, there's a favor I would like to ask of you." Nobody would hear the conversation that would be had between Heidi and her cousin, nor would anyone be aware that the result of it was that the legendary leader of the Black Hand had now become marked for death by the German Reich. Whether or not he would live long enough to see the end result of the chaos he had sown upon the world had yet to be seen. Chapter 174, The Death of Apis. Things had been going poorly for the Black Hand ever since they first began targeting Bruno and his family. At least 25% of their leadership had either vanished or met a grisly and mysterious end. No doubt somebody was targeting them all. In a way, it was their karma coming back to them for all the evil they had done both in this life and the one Bruno had come from. Currently, Dragutin Dimitrijevi, better known by the name of Apis, was at a port in what would one day become the independent nation of Croatia. He was looking at his ticket and passport carefully, as well as any other information he had, all of which was a false identity. He had taken rather extreme lengths to conceal his identity, going so far as to grow a full beard, permanently scar his face, and even wear an eye patch over one eye. Like the rest of his fellow conspirators, Apis was on the run. It was clear to him now that he was being hunted. 3 attempts had been made on his life over the course of the past week, which, though they appeared to be mere coincidences, he was not convinced of such a lie. No, 1 was a coincidence, 2 was suspicious, and 3 was a pattern. Someone was trying to kill him, though he did not know who. After failing repeatedly to harm Bruno and his family, and losing many talented agents in the process, the mysterious Balkans-based organization known by the name of the Black Hand, or a unification or death, depending on who you asked, had ultimately taken Bruno off their hit list. It took some time for German intelligence to properly discover the identities of the Black Hand and their agents. But after some, shall we say, extensive interrogation sessions between the various operatives that German authorities had captured from the shadowy syndicate, the Reich had more or less discovered the entire network and their political machinations. Naturally, considering the extensive ties that Heidi had to German intelligence via the distant half of her family's exceptional bloodline, it was only a matter of time before she learned about those targeting her husband. She had whispered a few words, and a few members of the organization went missing or found themselves the victims of an unfortunate and tragic accident. But it didn't end there. No, Heidi was very angry, beyond displeased with the Black Hand for trying to harm her loved ones. And while she didn't have the ability to take her vengeance against the von Wittelsbachs for their role in her mother's untimely death, she did have the means to strike against these damned Balkan fanatics. Because of this, what remained of their leadership was now on the run, trying to hide in distant countries outside of Europe's immediate sphere of influence. After all, they didn't know whether it was the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, or the Hohenzollerns who were targeting them, but Europe was the domain of the United Imperial Powers. At least Central Europe was, and these three mighty empires were more than capable of striking far beyond their own borders. With this in mind, Apis was trying to get to Latin America, which he believed was free from the influence of these powerful and ancient dynasties. He hoped that he and his fellow conspirators could further foster and coordinate their movement for the liberation of the Balkan nations from the hands of their current occupiers, from the safety of the New World. And it was a plan that seemed to be working thus far, as at least a quarter of the Black Hand's leadership had already fled to the countries south of the United States borders. Apis had just managed to hand over his fake passport to the customs official at the Croatian port. The man barely looked at the passport before stamping it with his approval and handing it back to Apis, while giving him some blanket statement or another about having a good trip. After which, there was still an hour's time before the ship Apis had boarded would depart. Since this was the case, the man decided to get himself a nice, hot cup of coffee from the ship's mess hall. He quickly approached the worker and smiled at the young man who appeared to be brewing the coffee for the ship's passengers. The worker smiled back and nodded at Apis, treating him as if he were any other customer. While preparing the cup of coffee, he was quick to ask if the man wanted anything additional added to the beverage. "Would you like some sugar and cream with that?" Apis' smile wore off as he looked at the man as if the question was obvious. People had been adding sugar to their coffee since 1625 when the Egyptians began experimenting with such concoctions. However, much to Apis' surprise, the worker did not add the mixture himself, but rather handed him a small plastic packet of what appeared to be sugar, along with a sealed Bakelite cup full of cream. He then thanked the man for his business before moving on to the next customer. "Thank you, sir. I hope you enjoy your trip." Apis mumbled something unintelligible in a disgruntled tone before shuffling off to his seat, where he broke out his newspaper and began to read the headline. German border fortifications prompt response from French head of state. The man mindlessly opened the packet of what appeared to be sugar and added it to his cup of coffee before also pouring the cream inside. Once he had done so, he mixed the concoction together with a spoon before taking a hearty sip. Perhaps because he was so entranced with the story in the paper, he did not notice the man who had served him his coffee staring at him from the corner of his eye, smirking something wicked immediately after he saw Apis sip the stirred coffee. Apis didn't realize it, but the man who served him his coffee was an agent of the Kaiser, or more specifically the German Foreign Intelligence Agency. The sugar, which was handed to him sealed in a plastic packet, was laced with a deadly and damn near untraceable poison known as ricin. Ricin, even in the smallest doses, was extremely lethal and could be absorbed into one's skin. It was because of this that it was sealed in a plastic package, no doubt created by one of the factories which Bruno had invested in. In addition to this, the man wore latex gloves while preparing the coffee, just to ensure that the laced sugar did not accidentally break open and afflict him with its poison. Because of this, Apis had unknowingly signed his own death warrant. He would spend the next 72 hours coming down with the most brutal fever and sickness imaginable before finally expiring in a way that was inexplicable to those who were unaware of how ricin affected the body. Needless to say, it was a far more disgusting mess than if he had been stricken with cholera. However, when the trip was finally over and his body was discovered soaked within its own putrid fluids, it was assumed that the man had simply caught a fever and died. Nobody would have guessed that the leader of the Black Hand had been assassinated by the agents of the German crown, nor that it was done at the request of Bruno's wife. And while Apis' death was a significant blow to the Black Hand, its actual effect on whether or not the timeline proceeded as planned was limited. Apis, while the leader of the Black Hand, could easily be replaced by the existing leadership, and his death would not deter the fanatics also known by the name of unification or death. Rather, he would become a martyr for their cause, as they mistakenly blamed the Habsburgs for the murder of their fearless leader. This prompted them to make preparations for retaliation, but that retaliation would have to wait. The year was 1911, and soon enough, the Balkans would come into turmoil as the Ottoman Empire sought to reclaim lost territory from the Young Turk Revolution, which had transpired years prior. And when that happened, the Habsburgs would be an afterthought, because for the next 2 years, the Balkans would be embroiled in warfare that itself would eventually lead to the Great War. Apis would be remembered by the people of Serbia as a national hero following his death, and would be honored by the Serbian king for his good deeds. But for those who were aware of his sinister activities hidden among the shadows, he would be condemned as a blackguard of the most reprehensible variety. But his sins in this life, and those of the Black Hand, were still for the most part a highly regarded secret. They would not come to light for a very long time yet. Chapter 175. The Italo-Turkish War begins. Apis' death had only further emboldened the Black Hand to gain their vengeance against the Habsburgs, as well as steeled their resolve toward their ultimate goal of independence and unification of the Balkans under a single banner. Either way, it was entirely possible that Heidi's actions had hastened the start of the upcoming Great War. Or it would have been, if not for the fact that less than half a year after the grisly death of Apis aboard a ship headed for South America, war broke out in the Balkans. But that was a story for another time. In fact, as 1911 began drifting into its final few months, an interesting conflict broke out that would help contribute to this madness. Italy, having been given a sense of security by joining the Allied powers, had decided now was the time to press some of its former claims. For complex diplomatic reasons, mostly tied to the great powers all desiring the same pieces of the pie during the scramble for Africa, which occurred a century prior, Italy had a claim on Libya, and currently, the Ottoman Empire was the ruler of the region. However, because of the many, shall we say, chaotic undertakings within the Ottoman Empire, which one might call the natural course for all multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious societies, the Ottoman Empire was in a state of collapse, more or less. The Young Turk Revolution had forestalled the inevitable by a few years, but the problems that were bound to occur eventually were just beginning to manifest themselves. The Balkans, ever a location rife with tension, was like a powder keg that had been lit with a slow fuse, and that slow fuse, after years of burning, was just about to go off. Over the course of the last few years, ethnic and religious tensions had been rising within the region between the native European populations and the Turkish occupiers. And these scuffles, as we might call them, were only growing in intensity as the years passed. It didn't help that Serbia was stoking the flames by providing Catholics within Ottoman-occupied Balkan regions with arms and munitions to continue the fight. This, along with Italy's joining of the Allied powers, had compelled them to declare war on the Ottoman Empire and stage an amphibious landing of some 20,000 men on the coast of Libya. Currently, Bruno was within the headquarters of the Central Division of the German Army's High Command, listening to reports of what was happening in Libya. He, of course, knew what would happen. Italy, using modern technology such as early armored cars and aircraft, would overwhelm the Ottomans and win the war within a year. This, in turn, would embolden the resistance groups in the Balkans, as well as the nations supporting them, into starting the First Balkan War. After disputes between the nations comprising the so-called Balkan League, this would lead to the Second Balkan War. And finally, after the Second Balkan War concluded, the Archduke of Austria would be assassinated during a visit to Serbia. The rest was, as they say, history, because Bruno knew exactly what would happen and how it would occur, assuming the butterfly effect didn't slap him in the face with something crazy and unexpected. He was smoking a cigarette and drinking from a glass of beer. All while the other generals of the German army spoke in surprise at the technology the Italians were fielding. Initial reports suggested some difficulties in the landing operations, but it wasn't something the Italians couldn't overcome. The Ottoman army, after all, was a shadow of its former self, capable of being trounced by even the minor powers in the Balkans. The Italians, who many might say had the worst army in Bruno's past life during the Great War, needed at most a year to take Libya from the Turks and their wretched state. Bruno's expression was as indifferent as ever when he corrected something that Field Marshal August von Mackensen had just said. They're not telegraph stations, they're wireless telegraph stations. It would appear that the other great powers have begun to catch up to our preparations. This was a wild overstatement, as German communications technology had advanced tenfold over the last decade and was now on par with its 1930s-era counterparts. Bruno was not the man responsible for this, not directly, at least. However, he did acquire significant talent in the field of wireless communications and threw a fat stack of cash at them. With damn near unlimited investment, These scientists and engineers were more than capable of accomplishing 3 decades worth of achievements within a fraction of the time. At the end of the day, scientific advancement was often hampered not by the minds of the men who created it, but by the lack of foresight of their investors, who refused to give the funding where it was necessary and in the amount required. It was the entire reason that, during Bruno's past life, ventures into space had more or less regressed since the moon landing in 1969. As for what Bruno had said, even August von Mackensen was aware of the exaggerated manner in which Bruno had sarcastically praised their rivals. Whether it was wireless telegraphs, field telephones, or radios, the German army's communication system was not only significantly more advanced than their rivals, who were just now fielding the likes of wireless telegraphs, but also encrypted in a way that was damn near unbreakable with current technology. Because of this, Bruno was mocking the natural development of technology that Germany had long since superseded as a result of his interference in the timeline. Even the field marshal couldn't help but laugh at Bruno's mocking tone and join in the fun. It appears that is indeed the case. Over the years, von Mackensen had gone from resenting Bruno to distrusting the man, to finally seeing him as not only a valuable asset to the German Reich, but also a good friend. Bruno's instincts were generally on point, and if the man was not anxious about the current situation or the advanced technology the Italians were currently fielding, then there was no reason for him to be either. Because of this, the aging field marshal sat down next to Bruno and pulled out a cigarette of his own from the pack hidden inside his coat's internal pocket. After lighting the device and taking a long drag, he finally asked Bruno bluntly for his opinion on the current conflict, which the world's many great powers were watching with keen interest. What do you make of this invasion? Bruno himself was in the middle of a smoke, and after exhaling a plume from his lungs, he was quick to respond to the question asked of him with an almost nonchalant tone in his voice. The Ottomans will stop the Italians briefly, but the Italians will send more men. By this time next year, the war in Libya will be the least of our worries. August von Mackensen looked at Bruno with a cautious glance. By the way Bruno was speaking, there was something far nastier than this conflict across the Mediterranean for them to worry about, and Bruno was usually right when it came to such things. Because of this, he asked, almost with a sense of trepidation in his tone, about what awaited them all at the end of this war. Oh, if that is the case, then what should we be worried about? Bruno put out his cigarette in the ashtray with a slight tap. There was nothing but the filter left, and once he had done so, he straightened up from his relaxed posture and looked into August von Mackensen's haggard gaze with a grim look on his face, before posing a question of his own that answered the question. Tell me, General Feldmarschall, you're a man of many wars and deep knowledge on global affairs. If Italy were to smash the Ottoman army in Libya with little effort, what would happen to the Ottoman Empire? Specifically, in the territories they still hold within the European continent. August von Mackensen's eyes opened wide as he suddenly understood what Bruno was implying, saying what was said without explicitly being spoken with his own words. It would be revolution. Bruno finally showed some form of emotion on his face in the form of a sinister smile as he nodded his head in approval of his superior officer's realization before posing another question, much like the one he had just said no more than a minute prior. And if the Balkan Christians beneath Turkish rule were to revolt, how would their neighbors respond? It was only now that August von Mackensen fully realized what Bruno was saying and the full weight of the words he had not said directly. He didn't want to believe it, and was quick to ask if what Bruno was saying was what he believed. You don't mean? Bruno quickly cut off his superior officer while standing up from his desk. He answered the legendary German field marshal's question with a single quote from a man greater than either of the two of them. One day, the great European war will come out of some damned foolish thing in the Balkans. Otto von Bismarck.